Welcome to another episode of the Single Malt Frontier, where we explore the edge of innovation in American single malt whiskey and all those related topics, single malt and so on. On this show, we do a little bit of tasting and a lot of talking. And the best thing about whiskey are the conversations that we get to have, and we get to talking about a little bit of everything. I was just thinking recently that it's a shame that we focus so much on brands sometimes because we lose track of the awesome people that are behind the brands. And of course, this show is about the people. But as much as anything, I think that we should renew our focus on actually talking about the people and what makes them awesome. Because I don't know about you, but a lot of the brands that I like drinking are brands that I know something about. Right? I've got a great story behind meeting the people or enjoying the liquid or a personal anecdote, and just it really helps me to connect with them. So I know that our guests today are perfect for those types of anecdotes about themselves and about the brands that they work with. So today is going to be a perfect show. So before we get into talking to Lost Lantern about everything that they do, Adam and Nora, thanks for joining us. So just a little bit of self-promotion before we get started, as usual. So we've done it. We're in the process of doing a bit of a rebranding. You've seen the new name, Single Malt Frontier. We've still got new logos and everything coming out. So be patient for that. Everything that we do on this show is out of pocket. Sometimes we get free samples from our guests, which is awesome. But one of the ways that you can support us is to either go to our Ko-fi or Ko-fi links and drop us a donation. Or if you like to get something for your money, Phil makes these lovely pens out of barrel staves. And if you are interested in those, you can find Phil on the Whiskey Lodge. As usual, there will be a link to the Whiskey Lodge in the comments. Looking great. That's a Maker's Mark blank. Mine was made from a wild turkey stave, which is really cool. And as I've joked before, they're beautiful. They feel nice. And if you believe, they smell like whiskey. So without further ado, I think that's about all of the self-promotion that we could possibly stand. So Adam and Nora, thanks for joining us. How are you doing?
Well, thanks so much for having us.
Excited to be here.
Yeah.
And I want one of those pens. That's super cool.
Phil can make that happen.
Just
name the distillery.
He can make it happen in exchange for money, which is fair.
Or if you send him barrel staves, then he could probably quid pro quo on that. So that works out nicely too. All right. So yeah, without further ado, Nora and Adam, could you introduce yourselves and your company and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. I'm Nora Ganley-Roper. I am one of the two co-founders and general manager at Lost Lantern Whiskey. Do you want to say?
I'm Adam Polonsky. I'm the other co-founder and the head of whiskey sourcing.
So Lost Lantern Whiskey is inspired by Scottish independent bottlers. The history that has gone on now for 200 years in Scotland of buying whiskey from all over the country there and highlighting whiskey that wouldn't otherwise be seen because it's either blended or just would never see the light of day otherwise. And that model was something that we wanted to bring to the US, the idea of finding great things that wouldn't be found otherwise or showcasing another side of a distillery that wouldn't be seen. So we buy whiskey only from the US, from all across the country. And we highlight one distillery through a single cask or small blend of their whiskey, or we blend whiskey from multiple distilleries together. We are talking about single malt tonight, but we do all styles of American whiskey. So bourbon, rye, single malt, corn whiskey, malted wheat whiskey. We like to do it all. And we're based in Vermont. So it's still kind of light out, but it will be dark by the time we're halfway through this. So yeah.
I can relate to that. It gets sunset is 8:47 today, which is in 3.5 hours. So yeah, Pacific Northwest, by the way. I don't know if you guys knew that. I think my audience knows that by now. But yeah, Seattle area here. So that's great. Independent bottling is, I feel like it's, at least from my perspective on the world and the industry, it feels like it's grown to have more recognition than it did just 4 or 5 years ago in the United States, right? But of course, classic facet of the industry in Scotland. If anything, single malt is the newer thing there, in very literal ways, right? So the fact that independent bottling and independent blending is such a new thing in the United States is like kind of surprising, and it's such a cool facet of the industry. So I know that y'all didn't come from whiskey production originally, but you've been tied in with the industry for a while. Um, for the people who aren't familiar with you, and I know like half of the chat has had you on their own shows, so that's the thing. But for everyone else who doesn't know you, could you give us a little bit of background, just the short version of how you came to be at Lost Lantern, or how you came to found Lost Lantern?
Yeah, well, it started with us having the same conversation that you just alluded to, which is this has been around in Scotland forever. It's never been in the United States. That seems kind of weird. Why is that the case? And the realization that part of the reason for that is the industry here until the last 15, 20 years was super consolidated. It was the big places in Kentucky and Tennessee and MGP. And that was about it. And a few small craft places that got started early. But now, as you well know, there's 2,600 distilleries across the country. And just as independent bottling in Scotland exists and became well known because they were shining a light on single malts that were otherwise going to blends, here we think, helping people discover whiskeys that they otherwise wouldn't discover just because there are so many distilleries out there, and most of them have pretty regional distribution. So that unless you're paying like way too much attention to this, then you're just not going to know most of what's out there. So we as an independent bottler do that work for whiskey lovers, and hopefully people trust our palate and enjoy what we discover.
Yeah, and the idea for Lost Lantern, we spent years complaining about how an IB did not exist, focusing on American whiskey, years. And then eventually that turned into, someone's definitely going to do this soon, to maybe we're the right people, to we're definitely the right people. I mean, I have a business background. I worked in finance and startup operations, but I also worked as sales manager at Astor Wines and Spirits for a number of years. And that's where I developed my palate, because I had to be the escalation point for all the nerdy questions. So I had to have tasted everything in the store and know all the weird esoteric things about just about everything we had in there. And
I came in as a journalist, originally writing for a spirits trade magazine about the business, and then increasingly getting to know more and more about whiskey, and then eventually transitioned to writing for Whiskey Advocate, which is the country's biggest whiskey magazine, and reviewing American whiskey from across the country. So I have started to really get to know a lot more of these distilleries myself, right as they were really on the rise, and start some of them coming into their prime. And I think that's really what sparked the light bulb that, like, oh, not only can this now happen, we're the ones to do it. And I'm sure many people have had the experience where, like, you come up with a great idea and you talk about how great of an idea it is for a while, and then somebody else does it, and then years later you're like, I had that idea and it totally would have worked. But I was like, this is the idea where I'm like, if that happens and someone else does this, it will happen eventually, and I'm going to be mad about it because they're not going to do it the way that we think that they should. And we're like, all right, well, then we have to do it.
Yeah.
Just like Thanos when he had to decide to, you know.
All right, no snapping fingers tonight. I don't think we want half of us to disappear. But if half of us were to disappear, I know which two of us I would want to remain around, because what you're doing is, and to be clear, it's the two of you. Because what you're doing is really a great service to the industry. I think what's fun to me is you know, I like where I can to draw a personal connection. Maybe that's a little bit too conceited of me, but I think that it's cool that you know, how I got into whiskey podcasting was the snowball that kept rolling. And originally I just wanted to write reviews of the stuff that I had tried, because sometimes you find something surprisingly good. Sometimes you find something you think is good that's not going to be so good. And I have way more tolerance for finding things that you trying things that I don't like than my friends do, right? So, you know, a lot of my friends are going to be like, oh, I had a bad whiskey once, I don't like whiskey, right? And so I wanted to help my friends avoid that as much as possible. You know, tell them what's good out there, and maybe what I don't personally recommend. Not to say that's not good, but it's not for me, so maybe it's not for you either. And I built my palate around making recommendations to people, and did that just for years. And it's a very abstract thing, right? I get to sit behind a keyboard and make arbitrary recommendations of things with, you know, no evidence or no skin in the game, really, right? Someone goes off and buys something that I recommended, and they either come back to me for more recommendations, or they think that my recommendations are crap, and they never talk to me again. But you put your money where your mouth is, right? Your business is literally built around finding the recommendations that work. And I think you fit into a really nice position in people's finding of distilleries. There's the big name, everything, you can always find it. It's always out there. And then there's the long tail of small brands that you've never seen before. And somewhere in between is a trusted voice in the industry that's going to help you try those small brands you haven't seen before. And that's where you come in. And that's such a great place to be. And so, I've got 17 bottles of Lost Lantern behind me. That's, I don't have a small collection, but that's still, basically a 5%, somewhere 5, 7, 10% of my collection, right? Like, if I don't know what to buy, I'm buying Lost Lantern. If Lost Lantern releases something, I'm buying it, unless it's sold out already. And that happens to me occasionally too. So, no shortage of love here for Lost Lantern. And that's one reason why I think it's such a shame it's taken so long for us to have you on the show. But now that I've done, thanks, Jerm. I'm just putting myself out there fanboying now, and like at least other people agree pretty much with the sentiment, so that feels good. So I like to tell people, I've heard you say on podcasts before, and I don't know if you say this like all the time, but I think it's such a great anchoring point, that you basically have two rules. One is you're going to visit a distillery in person before you work with them, and the second is that you both, despite your differing palates, have to love everything that you release.
Yes.
The net effect of that is that everything you release, my prediction, right, is everything you release is going to be a crowd pleaser. And because you have a personal connection to those distilleries, everything you release has a nice story behind it, right? And I think that that's definitely panned out. And as I've tested the waters and bought 1 or 2 bottles, and then bought 17 bottles and replenished some of them, right? I don't buy seconds of things a whole lot, but this is one brand where I definitely will. So, yeah, it's a great set of rules to have. It's so simple and produces such good results. All that said, you started up pretty much in the height of the pandemic. That must have been hard to pull off.
And it was very, very stressful, because the original plan had not been to launch primarily through e-commerce, which is what we did eventually do and have done ever since. We originally planned to launch the traditional way in New York and California, and had a distributor all lined up, and we were about to send our first pallet of whiskey of American Single Malt to them, and they were going to pick it up on something like April 10th, 2020. And that, needless to say, did not happen. And for a couple months, we were like, what is going to happen with our business? That at that point we had already invested a bunch of money in whiskey and given up our jobs to do this, and we don't even know if the world was going to exist 2 years later. But it ended up being a huge benefit to us, because with the pandemic, the e-commerce platforms that we work with, places like Sealbox, really started to proliferate and get more well-known, and people got more comfortable with buying whiskey online. And also, I think a lot of people got excited about just diving really deep into whatever they were excited about and interested in. Right.
If people were going to be nerds about anything, that was the moment where it went full down the rabbit hole. And there were a lot of people that were reading about whiskey and discovering us. And it would have taken a lot longer to crack into some of the places that we were able to crack into. And also being able to ship to 40 states has made a huge difference in introducing us to people and helping introduce our distillery partners to people as well. And build enough of a kind of footprint online that now we're starting to move into more traditional distribution in key markets, that we can actually support that and know that there are people that are going to go out and buy our whiskey.
So I feel like the answer to this question is probably going to be a little on the pedestrian side, but 40 states is impressive for such a young company, given the complexity of American liquor laws. How did you pull that off so quickly? We
work with 2 retail partners, primary retail partners, and between the two of them, they ship to 40 states. We do not touch the legalities of going state to state. We leave that to the places that have to deal with the legalities. We sell them our whiskey and they tell us where they're shipping, and that adds up to roughly 40 states right now. It changes though, so every once in a while someone will come to our website and go, "What? I thought you could ship to my state," but because we don't control that, it's just where those retailers are shipping.
Yeah, but the great thing about it is that it just like really lets us accomplish the mission of getting whiskeys that are only regionally available to as many hands as possible, and that's been a really nice piece of it.
Yeah, so that's a work smarter, not harder answer. And it's one of those questions where it's like, yeah, I know the answer to this, but it's great to hear it from the people who set it up. So it does raise an interesting question, though. If it was effectively, I'm not going to say it was easy. I'm sure that there was, a certain amount of work that went into building those retail relationships. I know I've had a hard time with my single barrel, just trying to find someone who can carry it. It takes effort, right? It takes real, brand relationship effort to get that to happen. So not to downplay the fact that you didn't have to touch the legality, but you still had to make that happen. So no small thing. Well done. It does raise the question why so many of these smaller distilleries don't go into distribution the same way, though. Do you happen to know much about the inside of that?
I mean, I think you need to have a national presence to make it work. So we spend a lot of time doing PR and talking to a range of people in a way that a lot of small distilleries don't have the bandwidth to do.
And that, for most small distilleries, the best move they can make for their business, especially early on, is not to be available in 40 states. It's to own their backyard. Start with your county, then work your way up to your state. Some places don't even really need to go beyond that. I'm sure you've heard us say before, Cedar Ridge makes the top selling bourbon in Iowa, and they are available in other states, but Iowa is the core to their business. Most distilleries choose to focus their energy on their distribution in their home state or home region, and that is probably the correct decision for them. But because we're a smaller brand, we're at a higher price point, we're really talking directly to real serious whiskey lovers. It made sense for us to do this in a way it wouldn't for everyone.
Yeah, the focus is just different. So we invest in speaking to a national nerdy market, and then the distilleries focus on their local market. Yeah.
I guess maybe nerds like us think that everyone's a nerd, and so we forget that there is that whole difference in market. That definitely. Yeah, Jerm was saying you introduced him to several new distilleries that he never had a chance to find, and he can't thank you enough for that. So yeah, and similar praise, right? That's one of the great things is just that you're a brand that everybody recognizes that is introducing people to brands they don't yet recognize. And then comes the awful step 2 of I want more from this brand and I can't find it. So
wait for our next cask then, but I consider that a better than the alternative. If it's a brand that we're working with them, it doesn't just mean that we cherry picked a couple of barrels that we thought were amazing. It's that we think that their whiskey in general is good and worth someone's time. And nothing makes me happier than hearing what Jerm is saying, that someone not only discovered a whiskey through us, but then goes and drinks some of their stuff too. Obviously we want people to buy a Lost Lantern and enjoy that. But part of the whole point of this is to get people to try distilleries they wouldn't otherwise, and hopefully add them to their repertoire, especially for single malts, because there's nothing else like it in the world. Most American single malt is so different from Scotch or Irish whiskey or Japanese whiskey, and has flavors that there's nothing comparable to it. So it's fun to get people to try that for the first time and then be like, oh, it turns out I like mesquite smoked single malt. I had no idea.
So if you're okay with me mentioning a couple of other brands,
Yeah.
I think there's a few obvious ones to mention at this point. So you were not the first independent bottler operating in the United States, although you are the first to focus entirely on American whiskey, which is awesome. So obviously who was operating before you was Single Cask Nation, who you're friends with. You've been on their show more than once. So I have to imagine that focusing on American whiskey has given you a different lens through which to look at the available options. But you've also put the prism on the whole problem and separated out American whiskey into all of its separate categories that you've made a big point of the colors on your labels. And so that's a big part of your brand, is helping people not just discover the next single malt, but the next corn whiskey or the next rye or what have you, light whiskey, right? Things that maybe people aren't paying as much attention to. Could you, I guess, go into a little bit about how your focus on American whiskey has affected your the types of products that you release?
It's a good question. I think to partly answer that and partly answer a question you asked before, some of it came out of how we first launched the company and what we wanted to do with it. That the vision really always was to do American whiskey exclusively, at least at the beginning. And the decision to visit everywhere that we went to that we would work with came out of that too, that we really just wanted to see and understand for ourselves how distilleries are doing things firsthand. And it's a lot easier to do that when you stick to one country, even when it's a very large one. But just seeing for ourselves how much climate matters and how much the choices that distilleries make affect what their whiskey tastes like. Shows there's just such a broad swath of flavors from across the United States that like is far more than you can see in Scotland. And we both love Scotch, but Texas alone is 9 times bigger than Scotland. There's tremendous climatic variation. And that was only like a half answer. So
yeah, no, I mean, I think part of it for us with focusing on American whiskey and the fact that there is so much difference climate-wise is that we want there to be intentionality behind what our distillery partners do. If someone is making whiskey that tastes like Kentucky bourbon in Nevada, or someone that is making something that tastes like Scotch in Texas, that's less interesting to us. Part of it is exploring what the landscape of American whiskey looks like, to really do a deep dive. How are people playing with mash bills, be it 100% corn or having spelt in the mash bill? Like, what does it mean to be from that local environment? I think without having that focus and doing the travel that, especially these days, this guy has to do, we wouldn't be able to find those things. And to us, that is why we do what we do. It's not just to find cool whiskey. It's to help people discover the landscape. And I mean, our spring collection was our first regional collection, focusing on the Midwest, because we thought no one was paying enough attention to the Midwest, and there's so much good whiskey there. And our position as an independent bottler gives us the opportunity, but also I think it's really important that we do this kind of thing, but showcase why we're excited about things and give people an opportunity to participate in our view on the landscape of American whiskey.
All right, I have a follow-up that I'd already planned and another follow-up. So first follow-up, do you foresee or would you like to put out into the world your perspective? Feels like the wrong word, but like, let's say perspective, because every release that you're doing is coming through the perspective of your collective palates. So would you like to put out into the world your perspective on Scotch, like becoming an independent bottler of Scotch? And I'm not saying you're committing to this business plan, but just like, do you dream at night of what that would be like if you were to release Scotch into the world? And if so, what's a distillery that you'd like to work with?
I think we wouldn't say we won't ever do Scotch, but it's really important to us that we interact with the distilleries the same way we interact with distilleries here, which is very difficult in Scotland because, for those of you that don't know, most of the whiskey that IBs buy is through brokers. But for us, having that personal connection with the makers, be the owner or be it the distiller, and understanding the place is so much of our process. So we would be eventually maybe looking at doing something from Scotland, but it would have to be in that setup. And I think that means that it will likely be one of the newer distilleries if we were to do it.
And also that's really a large part of our purpose is helping people discover places that are a little smaller and less well known. So if we did it, not only would we'll only want to work with places that we could do it directly, we also want to shine a light on the smaller distilleries, because a lot of times those are the ones that have really interesting stories right now. Like I really like what Annabelle is doing at Dignean on the western Scottish coast, which is an all organic distillery, carbon neutral, net zero, and also making amazing whiskey with this great maritime influence to it. And it's still in its early days, but is spectacular. And there are many more like that, a lot on remote Scottish islands and things like that. And we also would very firmly hold to our rule that we can only work with places that we visited in person. And I very much do want to go trotting around to remote Scottish islands with Nora. I absolutely want to do that. But we also have a tasting room to run. So not right now. Someday, hopefully, but it has to be the same perspective of celebrating what is exciting and new in whiskey. And I would love to do a Lost Lantern Daft Melter. That would be really
fun. That's a great comment that I was about to highlight. And the other one, before we get too far beyond it, Spicy Strawberry says, even when I can find a certain distillery in my area, I know that Lost Lantern is going to be the best showcase of the quality of that distillery.
I love hearing that.
Yeah.
That's the magic of a good single barrel selection and an independent bottler whose palates you can trust.
Yeah, and I think beyond Scotch, like we've talked about doing world whiskey before, again, would have to have the same rules. Like, and I think then partly would interact with where we want to go spend a bunch of time. Like there's a ton of great distilleries in Tasmania and other parts of Australia, in Scandinavia, like do some Finnish or Norwegian whiskey, or the Icelandic whiskey made from smoked with sheep dung.
Probably not that. Probably not that.
But
But we never say
We're
never.
seeing the process right now.
But we never say never, including the potential to move outside of whiskey periodically. Like we've talked about that too. We stay focused for now so that we can build the trust that you're talking about, where people trust us, and so that when we step outside of the very core SKUs or the core product lines, that there are people that are going to be excited about that rather than just confused about what we're doing.
So as for that sheep dung smoked whiskey, I'm going to Iceland in a couple of months, and I'm gonna be trying my best to stop by Floki and buy a bottle of that if they still make that SKU. I don't know, because that's just, I like smoke from all different sources, and I guess that's a nice segue into what we're doing today, because our tasting has smoke in 3 different forms basically, and a few other things. So and sheep's dung is not one of them. Spoiler alert, but. That's yet another fun thing that I like, smoked from anywhere, right? The local fuel idea is such a cool conceit to me. Yeah. But before we go too much in that direction, my other sort of, I guess, unexpected follow-up to the earlier comment. So you've done a Midwest release. And besides that, you have representation among your bottlings from what I would consider every major region, climate-wise, of the United States. Do you find that there is a particular regional style that's jumping out at you from the 6 or 7 major regions of the United States? Or is regionality in that sense not really a thing?
I mean, in terms of, are there regional differences, or is there a regional difference that we really gravitate towards?
Whichever one of those is a more interesting question.
I think the first one is, so I think regionality in whiskey has to be a decision. Unlike wine, where you talk about terroir, there are people that are doing, like when you think about the Pacific Northwest, if we're thinking about single malts, there's a brewer tradition that speaks through the whiskeys that you see out of there, and that's how they actually ferment the barley and then distill it. But I think that there are other things. We see consistencies in cooler climates versus warmer climates, where you're getting less or more oak influence that goes beyond production methods. But you still have to lean into it. You still have to not climate control your warehouses. You have to pick grain that actually highlights those things. So I think we are seeing regionality. I think that like a Texas whiskey by and large tastes like a Texas whiskey. There's something about that heat there. But what it means to be in the Northeast is a little bit more subtle. I think Cooler climates aren't as aggressive in their dominance of potentially other flavors. I think that you can build whatever you want, but it takes a lot longer in a cooler climate. So I think that is my long-winded way of saying, yes, there is regionality, but probably 70% of it comes from the decisions that the production teams are making when they're making their whiskey.
And I think we'll see a lot more regionality over time. Like, it's just in its relatively early stages. And even in terms of the single malt distillers we've worked with, there are so many more American single malt distilleries that are on the cusp that have now been going for 5 to 7, closer to 10 years, that are starting to put out whiskey that's really exciting and interesting. Places that we haven't worked with yet, but probably will in the next year or two. And I'm excited for that to start to broaden beyond like the core set of players that those few people who know about and pay attention to American Single Malt are getting pretty familiar with at this point. There's a whole new generation around the corner. And then I hope another generation after that of places that maybe haven't even started yet, in places where we're not really thinking of American Single Malt coming from. Like, I would love to see more single malt coming from places that actually have a climate more like Scotland, places like the New England coast, like Maine, similar to what you see from 888 on Nantucket, which is wonderful and but hard to get. And I would really, really love to see a world-class American single malt distillery from Alaska with Alaskan barley and maybe some local sources of smoke as well. But
he wants a reason to go to Alaska. Let's be clear about this. Part of that is wanting to go to Alaska.
There's nothing wrong with that.
No, there is not. No, there is not.
I really just want someone else to invest many millions of dollars in building an Alaskan single malt distillery so I can go live there and buy 2 casks from them.
And they'll have to wait 30 years for it to age because it's all frozen in the winter.
Exactly.
Okay, so I want to try to start pivoting this train towards American Single Malt as a focus, because that's the main focus of this show. But before we get into that, could we just get a quick rundown of the labels, the meaning of the colors on the labels? This information is out there, but I think for the benefit of having it all in one place, if we could just real quick touch on each of those labels.
Yeah. So all our labels have a color scheme. The most important piece is that any label that is in blue is a multi-distillery blend. So it may be a blend of bourbons, it may be a blend of single malts, but in our current scheme, all multi-distilleries are blue. All American Single Malt, most American Single Malt is in brown. American Single Malt that is particularly distinctive and doesn't taste like you would expect single malt to taste like is in our cream label, which is what we did for our Andalusia triple distilled Texas single malt. We've done that for some St. George single casks. And then for Mountain Meadow, our St. George release that we put in gold, that's a very special release. So we wanted it to be a little extra shiny.
Yeah. And red is bourbon, green is rye as well.
Yeah, one question that I was asking people for a while is, everybody knows that rye is green, right? And then the sort of interesting follow-up question to that, as a single malt focused person, is what is the color of American Single Malt? And in your case, you've made that decision, right? That's not just a hypothetical. You have the brown label, but interestingly, also the gold label. And so, I just at the beginning of this call, I was asking a question that was kind of along those lines. What does that gold label actually mean?
That it's expensive. Yeah. That's what that means.
But that's a whiskey that's like truly unique and singular and like nothing else, which we think Mountain Meadow is. So that,
and there will
merits that price.
Probably be other whiskey in that color scheme this year. If not this year, next year. So,
And I had to try to check, but it's actually not in my sightline right now. The Andalusia, I didn't realize, was also in not a brown label.
That's cream. So anything that is either a very innovative process or a non-standard flavor profile will go into cream, because the idea is we don't want someone to think it's going to be very classic. and pick it up and not know what they're getting into. So we like to call it our innovation line.
Yeah, makes sense.
I think that randomly would taste like a classic triple distilled Texas single malt. It's just the only one. So we actually argued about that one for a bit, whether that would go into the brown or the cream label.
To be clear, when Adam describes it, he says cream is for the weird shit. So that's also the other way that you
weird that doesn't rise to special. It didn't quite make gold.
Yeah.
Now that's not, nobody should feel bad about that if you didn't make it to the gold label. You know, there's no bronze or silver. Everybody's just happy to be on the podium, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, the color scheme is one of those things that feels very obvious and intuitive to us who live and breathe this every day. And then we always have to remind ourselves, like, you have to explain the color scheme to people. Unless you have a huge shelf of them, it takes a while to figure it out. Although it's easier when you see like our summer bourbon last year and then they were all in red and you're like, oh, okay, I get that.
Right.
So it's actually
bourbon is red.
It's a bunch of things alongside each other.
Yeah, I think there's some that definitely like they're self-explanatory, right? The bourbon is red, rye is green. That's easy enough to pick up on. It's the exceptions, right? It's like, yeah. So, and blue, I don't think I got at first, but you know, we're gonna really quickly pivot into blending now, right? Like as we start talking, like just in terms of your chronology, there's really no way to talk about your involvement with American Single Malt without first talking about your blending project, because if I'm not mistaken, the American Batted Malt #1 is your very first bottling.
Yes, that's right.
And this, of course, is not a single malt in either the Scottish or the American reckoning. It is a blended whiskey in both the Scottish and the American reckoning. But there is a gray area where Scotland would call something a blended whiskey and the United States may not exactly. And that would be if you had two distilleries from the same state in the same blend, then you wouldn't have to call it a blended whiskey. Except you also couldn't call it an American single malt because the rules that we've proposed, you know, there's a lot of funky overlaps in the Venn diagram, really, when you get down to it. Yeah. So I guess a question that I would ask at this point, and this is going way out of order, so I apologize. If you were ever to release a blend of American single malts, let's say, to put a name on that category of things, that happens to all be from, say, Texas or say Washington, how would you label that product?
We would probably do it like we did with the American Batted Malt, except we would say instead of a marriage of American single malts from wherever it may be, it would be a marriage of Texas single malts from
and then list all the distilleries,
et cetera, because we didn't list out all the distilleries because we had to. We did it because we wanted to, and to showcase that. And that would be true for within a state too.
Yeah. And we have no idea how the TTB is going to handle blends of single malts because there's no guidance on that yet. So for now, it's just whiskey, which is kind of weird. So you'll notice on the Flame and Shadow labels, it just says Flame Whiskey, Shadow Whiskey. And those are all blended malts, 100% single malt. But the easiest way to handle it with the TTB was just to pull all of the kind of potential language off the front label and explain it in great depth on the back label.
By easiest, she means when it originally said Flame blend of mesquite smoked single malts from Arizona and New Mexico, TTB said no. So we tried. We tried to have blend of single malts in the front label. We figure we're always just going to say what we're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm a big fan of, longtime listeners will know that my favorite non-fanciful name that's on a label, right? And I genuinely mean favorite. It's a mouthful, but it tickles me so, right? The McCarthy's, I have to go find the bottle. And this isn't even the right one.
Is it whiskey distilled from a malt mash?
Yeah, whiskey distilled from a mash of Scottish peat malted barley and aged in blah, 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 right? And it's just this long, sprawling thing that just keeps going. And I'm just like, I love that because there's a legal requirement for exactly that phrase somewhere on the bottle, the way that they filed it. And that's what it is. and it's so beautifully descriptive, and yet that just probably doesn't sell very well. Like that particular, right, that language doesn't serve the brand, right?
It really
Although
does.
I think it does, right? And they've changed it, right? Like they've the lead billing on the labels for McCarthy's now is the first American single malt, which is always a fun thing.
So
But what you can say,
you don't go up to the bar in Buffalo Wild Wings and say, "Hey, barkeep, could I have your best whiskey distilled from a Scottish malted mash?"
But if you get a bartender that knows, he's a real one.
It's true.
All right, so I'm just gonna. So on the note of the first American single malt, right? You have the first American blended malt or vatted malt, because actually, blended malt exists. So to say that you're the first American blended malt actually is probably just completely inaccurate, because blend of malt whiskeys being 51% barley, and aged in new oak. If you took a bunch of those from different states, you put them together, you would have a blended malt whiskey according to the TTB right now. But what you have here is a blended whiskey the way that the SWA would think of blended whiskey, a blend of American single malt whiskeys from different distilleries. Mm-hmm. And you have the first such product of that.
And as you know, but as a lot of people probably don't, that's where the name American Vatted Malt comes from, because what is now called a blended malt in Scotland, which means it's a blend of 100% single malts, no grain whiskey, used to be called vatted malt, and until I think 2006, maybe 2009, and then they retired the term because no one knew what it meant. So we decided, okay, term that no one knows what it means in Scotland. That's perfect. Everyone will know what that means here.
Well, you get to at least define what that means.
And it was a fun homage for people who love Scotch and have followed it for a long time. That, all right, the Scots gave up vatted malt as a name, but we can do it over here.
And it was also an important marker for us with people. We figured when we launched that we knew enough to put a name like that on our bottle, because you have to know a certain amount of Scotch history to think to put that on. So that was an important early marker for us to kind of showcase that we understand the Scottish tradition.
Right. It's a subtle nod to the geeks, right?
Yeah,
when I first saw this bottle, right, I was just getting to be really geeky about Scotch. And I knew what that meant at that point, which is shocking to me, actually, thinking back on it, considering I'd only been studying quote unquote whiskey for a year and a half by that point. And I was like, this has to come from people who really know what they're doing, right? Who are well established. To me, this was the nerd snipe. This was the nerd signal, the bat signal to the nerd, right? This is something I should be paying attention to. What utterly flabbergasted me is when I found out this was your first ever release, because this is such a mature product, right? This touches on all the right notes of really demonstrating, right? I can taste at least several of, from Balcones and so on, that I had not had every one of the distilleries that was in this bottle by that point, but the ones that I had, I could taste them in the blend, and they didn't stick out like sore thumbs either. It's a cohesive product that also doesn't hide its components, and that's a very skill oriented thing to do. This is the best of blending right here. It really shows a mature product. And, I'm sure you've told this story a million times before, but I love to hear it. Could you talk a bit about how you made this product happen?
Yeah, so American Vatted Malt is the process for this is not one that we do for any of our other whiskeys, but we made it collaboratively with the brands. Because it was our first release, we wanted to get buy-in from some of our favorite single malt brands, and when we were traveling around the country, we heard from them that they were jealous of what we were doing, that we were getting to blend with each other's whiskey. So I think it was your idea eventually to invite everyone into a room and say, okay, if you're going to trust us with your whiskey, why don't we all do it together and get to know each other's whiskey? A number of the people that participated in this hadn't tasted each other's whiskey. So it was an opportunity for them to do something super cool. Little did we know at the time, but it also gave us access to whiskey that we probably wouldn't have gotten that early on otherwise, because everyone wanted to show off for each other and bring some really cool stuff to the blending table. So we all, you're grabbing a photo of all of us from that day. And we got everyone in a room in Denver and spent a day blending all together, tasting everyone's samples, and then everyone put together blends, and then we voted on it and picked one that we were down to two, one that tasted a lot more like Scotch and one that ended up being much more American Single Malt. It had more new oak on it. It was a little bit stronger proof wise, and it felt like the right fit. And then we ended up having Virginia Distillery Company bottle it for us, and we slow proofed it, which really helped bring together all of those disparate flavors.
Yeah, here's a photo in our tasting room from when we did the blending session. So the whole crew got the folks from Santa Fe and Westward and Copperworks and Virginia Distillery and
Triple
Randy
Eight
from Triple Eight, and of course us.
and Balcones.
I'm like, oh man,
Jared.
I looked way younger back then.
Yeah, Jared's hanging out in the back of that photo.
Yeah.
Jared's hanging in the back. He didn't eat anything the entire day until we were done blending because he didn't want. He took it extremely seriously, and then
it was fascinating watching everyone's process. I mean, one of the great things for us as independent bottlers, as we've developed how we blend, is to take our favorite things from each of our distillery partners. So steal some process things from everyone. And that was the first time that we started saying, oh, I like how they did that, or that does not fit my palate. And building how we at Lost Lantern Blend that was the first step for us in building our own process.
And the whole project in some ways, besides that we obviously want to make something amazing, it was part of our answer to a question that we haven't really talked about, which is not why do you start an independent bottler for American whiskey, but how do you do that when there never has been one before that's focused on American whiskey? And just being able to get some of the biggest names in American Single Malt all together all at once and really helping to do this with us, it really helps to elevate us early on and get that Balcones trusted us, that Westward trusted us. And then that helped open a lot of other doors too.
Right. And so you've got the stamp of approval, essentially, of 6 different major American single malt producers to launch your brand.
Yeah.
And that you tied your cart to that horse, saying American Single Malt is going to be the thing that launches this brand. So I can only imagine that that's at least a signal to me that you're kindred spirits and that you think that American Single Malt is the driving factor behind independent spirits in the United States, at least right now, is the main, right, is the meteoric rise, right, is the main factor that's driving. Now, I'm sure there's different opinions on that. I wonder if I have that right, though. Or is it just that it felt like the right thing at that moment and it's really more general than that for you?
We certainly would never have launched with a blend of bourbons. We've done a blend of bourbon since then, and we love it, and it's been very well received. But I think it was really important to us at the beginning to show that American Single Malt was going to be a big part of what we do.
And it's where our heart is.
Yeah.
We love American Single Malt. We think that a lot of the most exciting innovation for us personally is in American Single Malt. We love bourbon and rye, but when it comes down to it, we're most jazzed about American Single Malt. So that's why it was important for us to start with that. I also think it's a place where we can really help shine a light even more than bourbon and rye, because a lot of the American Single Malt producers are small and doing innovative things. So they might not necessarily be as obvious to people. So we take that very seriously and do as much as possible when it comes to highlighting American Single Malt.
Was there, I guess, in terms of starting with single malt, was any part of that because that's following the example of well-established independent bottlers elsewhere in the world, which are mostly in Scotland?
Yes,
Yeah.
Totally.
And at the same time, this was our first release. It launched at the same time as our first 4 single casks, one of which was a single malt from Santa Fe. And then we had a bourbon and a rye and a corn whiskey. So it was our way of establishing like from day one, both that like we care very deeply about single malt. We're doing both a single malt and one of the very first American blended malts. And also we do all these other styles of whiskey. So that it was clear from the beginning that we were going to do a little bit of everything.
And that we're not just a blending house or a place that does single casks. That first collection was all about saying, we're doing all the things, folks. So yeah, it was definitely a combination.
Sorry, I was briefly distracted by Automod doing its thing. And then also, Spicy Strawberry, what time zone are you in? It's definitely not Friday evening. It's Thursday evening.
The eve of Friday.
Oh, Friday Eve, the night before Friday. Very
I'm
nice.
feeling that. I like that a lot.
Okay, well done. Touche. Okay. We can come back from that. Initially I thought that you were going to release American Single Malt with every one of your essentially quarterly releases. I think, is it every quarter or is it when there's enough that it's time to do a release?
Now that we have our own production space, it's every quarter.
We like to say it's seasonal. It doesn't mean that we won't skip a season periodically, but we call them spring, summer, winter, fall, winter.
Yeah, we have yet to do a mud season collection, but
you should figure out some distillery somewhere in the US that has mud in their process somewhere and just do a mud season release.
Well, I happen to know that Westland uses basically mud for their American peated whiskey.
Oh, I was going to say that, but then you said that, so that
I guess copper works too. Yeah.
Now, I think there is a distillery in Maine that's using also American peat and seaweed.
Yeah.
You have tasted
50
it.
Stone is the whiskey.
Yeah, 50 Stone.
That is on my list.
Do we have a 50 Stone to look forward to?
I have not tasted it, so that'll tell you something.
I have not tasted it in a number of years, and it tasted a little bit like seaweed the last time I had it, which I guess it should, but
you can decide if that's a good or bad thing for yourself.
Yeah.
All right, fair enough. Okay, so I said earlier before we went live that I would avoid tasting any of these things until we got to the tasting segment, but we were talking so much about vatted malt, I had to put some in the glass and at least smell it. So I think I have basically two questions that are not tasting related, and then we'll take a quick break and go on into the tasting because clearly we're chomping at the bit to get into these samples. So
journalist in me is going to have to do this and be obnoxious, champing at the bit.
Isn't that what I said?
You said chomping at the bit.
No, I messed it up. It was definitely champing in my head. So we'll go with that. Okay, so two last questions, or I guess two last points to make. So Adam has recently had a bit of news. Adam has been appointed to, I believe it's the board of the American Craft Spirits Association. Hopefully I have that right.
You do.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Yeah. So it was a few board seats had opened up, and I, as always, as with everything I do, was very transparent. I was like, hey, we are not a distillery. We're never going to be a distillery. But I spend like half of my time traveling the country, visiting distilleries, talking to them, seeing what's going well, seeing what's not going well for them. And also used to be in the media. And that gives me a unique perspective that a lot of other distilleries don't have. And that's something that we've learned over the last couple of years, is that people have started looking to us for, even at distilleries, for like what's going on at other distilleries. Because if you're making whiskey every day, you can't just go jet off from Washington to Arizona just to scope things out for fun. But like for us, that's a core part of our job. So we really have a level of exposure that a lot of other places can't, and they only see each other at the conferences. So I was very honored that people chose to elect me for that, and excited to represent the industry in that way. And as the first independent bottler on the board of directors of the American Craft Spirits Association.
That's awesome. Obviously, is an organization that I admire. That's the first major industry conference that I went to, and it's full of great people with a great philosophy. It makes sense. Everything that you said. You're basically you've unofficially been the pollinator of the industry, and now you get to officially be the pollinator of the industry, flying around and visiting all the pretty flowers. Have I tortured this metaphor enough?
The perfect amount. You're good. You're good.
Keep going. Keep going.
Yeah, break out the thumb screws.
All right, and one other piece is that you just got back from a trip to Texas. Can you talk about who you were visiting?
Can we? Not really. I don't think
So
can.
we weren't visiting distilleries. There will be more on what we were doing, but we're not ready to talk about it. It's yeah, a thing that we're working on, but it's not. It's explicitly not public yet, so we can't.
Okay.
We
Yeah.
did
Fair
see
enough.
all of our Texas distillery
We did
buddies.
see a lot of buddies,
Yeah.
but did not visit any distilleries. We're just making it worse.
Yeah, we drank a lot of very nice whiskey
Yeah.
while we were doing it. But
Nice.
Yeah.
So, and here I was hoping that we were going to get another Andalusia cask.
sorry, no spoilers.
No spoilers. Yeah.
I did come back from Texas with my suitcase stuffed full of
And
samples.
my suitcase stuffed full, which is unusual.
of barrel samples of American Single Malt and Texas distilleries. So sometimes it's easier to just pick it up in person when you're down there.
Yeah, I was going to say that seems not terribly common. You're probably getting samples in from all over through the mail, or not the mail, but wherever.
No, through the mail.
However
Probably
things get to you.
Yeah, through UPS and FedEx, because legally distillery to distillery shipments are legal for what it's worth. So, but yes,
Yeah,
not
to the
USPS.
post office.
Note to self: start a distillery.
Yeah, right. It's so simple, so easy.
And
Anybody can do it.
Yeah. We have a distillery license, even though we're not a distillery, so we're covered.
Right. I was going to ask. So, I guess you don't need to be an active distiller to have a DSP.
So we technically have, there are 3 things that you check on the DSP license that you can have. One of them is distilling, one of them is rectifying, and one of them is warehousing.
Mhm.
And we have the second and the third. So they're all under DSP, but and all distilleries will have the 3, but places that don't have a still, they'll have the other 2.
Gotcha. So I don't know if this is considered a hot potato at all, but do you consider yourselves a non-distilling producer? Given that term seems to have collected some ire of late.
No. So we actually use the term to describe a certain style of sourcing company. So for us, we talk about independent bottlers like what we're doing, where you're buying from all over the place, fully transparent, focused on the story of your distillery partners and the underlying distilleries and regionality and all of that. We think of a blending house as a place that is very transparent, that they're buying from multiple places, but it's more about the art of the blend. To us, the American example of that is barrel, like making wonderful whiskey, but it's more focused on blending than about the underlying producers, but you can totally figure out who they work with. And then we use NDP for places that are just focused on their brand. They're likely only sourcing from 1 or 2 places, maybe 3 now that there's Bardstown. And it's really, you could almost miss the fact that they're sourcing. They're not totally hiding it necessarily, but it's not what that's about. And so, yeah, I mean, if you use NDP as the overlying umbrella, but we use it internally to try to distinguish as we see brands roll out, how they sit, because all of it, as with all of the whiskey we buy, is very much categorized so that we understand what the landscape looks like over time. I feel like you didn't expect to get that kind of answer, but we do think about
it's
things that
perfect, right? We like that kind of nuance here.
That sort of falls in line with what I've been telling people when they ask me, which is that there are independent bottlers who are showcasing their source, blenders who are creating a product from multiple sources, and non-distilling producers that are brands.
And non-distilling producers often are not only buying from only 1 or 2 sources, they usually have like a consistent pipeline with that source where they will have like 1-year whiskey and 2-year whiskey and 3-year whiskey and 4-year whiskey and 5-year whiskey from that place so that they can build a consistent whiskey that will not really change over time and will have a continuous supply for it. Whereas like we are not terribly interested in consistency when we're releasing whiskey from all over the country that tastes totally different. So it's same basic procedure of sourcing, but many different approaches to it.
It's interesting that you say that you're not thinking too much about consistency, because my perception of, and I have a lot of examples, is that there actually is a kind of consistency. I think there's a flavor profile that you tend to hit, in as much as, you know, the distilleries are all very different from each other, right? Like I'm not saying that all the whiskey tastes the same. It really doesn't, right? There's a lot of variation, but there's something about it, right? There's the crowd pleasing sort of core, like there's notes in common, right? I think that there's a through line through all your releases, and that makes sense because you're picking stuff that you both tend to like. So there's going to be some, probably not always, but most of the time, there's probably going to be some overlap between the types of notes that you get.
Yeah, there's a consistency in our perspective, certainly. Yeah. And also apparently.
Yeah, exactly. That's Germ put it much better than I could have. You're consistently fantastic. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, consistency from a quality perspective is really important to us, because if we show that you can trust us, you'll keep coming back and trying things that you've never heard of. So that's a huge focus for us in everything we put out.
Yeah, this it's so funny that you know, whenever you guys release a new series, I'm like, I gotta go check the budget, because it's like a foregone conclusion that I'm going to buy as much of your stuff as I can, as long as I can do so. So, and then on the couple of times that I've hesitated even slightly, I've missed out. So I missed out on Tom's hat.
Tom's Foolery. Yeah.
Tom's Foolery. Yeah.
That is our fastest selling rye ever. That surprised us. Yeah.
I think I had about 5 minutes to pull the trigger before it was completely gone on both places. So yeah. Anyway, you know, if that doesn't speak to the momentum that you're gaining, right? A relatively small distillery that a whole lot of people hadn't heard of before, that sold out faster than anything. I can attribute
rye,
that to,
which is a not terribly popular category of whiskey, if I'm being honest, even though that isn't my favorite category of whiskey.
Yeah, and that one was particularly exciting to us because it was a distillery that very few people knew about. We've had very fast sellouts before from places like St. George and Balcones, which are the like world-class names in American Single Malt. That was not so much because of us as because of Balcones and St. George. But for this and for the rise that we did from Corbin Cash in California, which also did very, very well. And some of the things that we've done from Whiskey Del Bach, which does have some name recognition, but not to the level of St. George. Those have gone very well, and we are glad that people started to really trust us.
Yeah, it definitely speaks to some momentum behind the brand Lost Lantern. Besides that, do you think there is anything particularly about that release that made it go so quickly?
It helped that we had put out a bourbon from them that everyone loved, that didn't sell as fast. It sold pretty quickly. It only took like a couple of days to sell out. But I think after people had tasted their bourbon, and a couple of reviews had come out before, it was just a no-brainer for a lot of people, even though it's on the more expensive side for us.
What even is price? I literally wasn't paying attention.
This is why
you guys are single-handedly driving up the average cost of bottles in my collection.
And that's fair, but like one of the hard things is like we want our whiskeys to be as accessible as possible, but we are working on a pretty small scale, just buying a few casks at a time from all over the country and moving them to Vermont. And a lot of these distilleries don't need to sell to us. They sell to us because they want to be a part of it and get their name out there, but they could sell it to their own customers in their own state already. So there's some opportunity cost for them and giving up the barrels. So it means the whiskey for us ends up being expensive, which means the release ends up being expensive. But luckily, people seem to get that. Plus everything is cask strength, and that's always nice.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's talk just a little bit about scale. So you've been going for about 4 or 5 years, give or take.
3.5 officially.
Obviously, you're growing the momentum, right? Things are selling out faster. I think we're getting to a point now where Lost Lantern is becoming a bit of a hot commodity. It's a great place for you to be. You're increasing your resources. Your team has grown. You've got a tasting room, right? The operation is for sure growing. Are we going to start seeing a higher velocity in terms of cask releases or number of bottles available in the near future, or is it going to be pretty much the same rate?
We're not going to go more than 3 or 4 releases a year because it feels overwhelming even to us. I mean, I look at Scotch Malt Whiskey Society and they do an alternate every month in the US, and it's got all the numbers and like fanciful names, and I just find it a little, to me it's a little confusing. I think it's more like we will do the same number of collections that will gradually become larger in terms of the number of releases within it. People have generally not batted an eye when we're like, all right, last summer we did 7 things at once and it was fine.
This summer it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, this summer is going to be is real big. And
yeah,
and some of the blends that we're doing are gradually getting a little larger.
That's how we grow volume is through our blends, and we're starting to go into more traditional distribution, and especially the far-flung bourbon and far-flung rye. That's how we make Lost Lantern more widely available while keeping the super special single cask probably focused primarily online in the short term because they're so small. And so giving people who are dedicated, continuing to get access to the most exciting things that way without placing it at a store and having it only go to people that are within driving distance of that store.
And being slightly bigger also gives us the chance to do things that are a little more experimental, like what we did with Flame and Shadow, which are, to my knowledge, the first 2 smoked blended malts made with American whiskey. So a mesquite smoked blended malt and a peated blended malt. And we didn't do those because they're going to like set the world on fire in terms of sales. We did them because like we really want to push the conversation around blending and around smoked whiskey and get people to try both mesquite, this new style of smoke, and peat in an American scent, and Scottish peat, but like aged in America, and to push the envelope in that regard. So those were not huge releases. But just being able to do them at all was a sign that we had gotten some confidence in where we
not
were
need to sell them immediately so that we can buy more casks. We can do something because it's something that we feel really strongly about, and they can sell however long they need to take for people to get excited about them. So yeah.
Okay, sounds good. So we're getting dangerously close to just talking about everything that we have lined up to taste today. So I think now is a great time for us to take a quick little bio break so that we planned this in advance about an hour in. Take a little break and then come back and taste all these whiskeys that we have here. Make our faces a little bigger so that, you can see our reactions like real time. So everybody stick around for about 2 minutes and the stream will stay on. We'll be right back.
Yeah, BRB.
Weirdly, I'm not actually going to go anywhere. So I'll entertain the audience somehow. I didn't prepare any magic tricks. And I left my top hat downstairs, so I can't even pull a rabbit out of my hat. Although we do have a rabbit. I don't think she'd fit in my top hat, though. Any questions before we... Thank you, Freedom Malts, for reminding me that I do have other things going on. This year, I am running once more the Virginia Whiskey Tournament, which is someone put it to me, basically a popularity contest of distilleries within the Commonwealth of Virginia that produce whiskey. There are 54 this year. Today I released the 9th video of me filling the bracket. Voting doesn't start until the 3rd of June. It's going to start with bouts 1 and 2. And basically how it's going to work is there are going to be polls on Instagram and Twitter, and you guys get to vote on your favorite Virginia distillery. I know that most of most of you probably aren't in Virginia and haven't had an opportunity to taste a lot of Virginia whiskey. But I'm working on figuring out videos and getting a hold of people at these distilleries to tell a little bit about them. That'll be on my YouTube channel, The Ranger's Respite, and probably also on Instagram to an extent, also The Ranger's Respite. And yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. It was last year. The bracket is a little bit funny this year because of the weird number of whiskey producing distilleries in the Commonwealth of Virginia. There are 54 this year. Nice. That was a good one.
Got to get the pops on microphone.
And last year's winner, Catoctin Creek, and the 2022 winner, Falls Church Distillers, basically get a bye for the first round. They're coming in at the second round, which will begin in mid-July.
Does this count as our first official mid-roll advertisement?
I mean, I don't want to say that I'm easy to buy off, but if you want an advertisement, I can be paid in whiskey, barrel staves, and chocolate.
Well, don't sell us short, Phil. We've got to still make up the bill for the weeks where we have to buy our own whiskey.
True.
But that said, like we never got into this for money, so it's just because we didn't get into it for money doesn't mean that it wouldn't be nice. I see now why someone asked if I hadn't tried the Cedar Ridge finished in a sherry cask. I think, as a matter of fact, I actually have not. And there are reasons for that. For one thing, I've been basically doing a bit of a dry month, so it's been hard to get into much of anything because it's all sip and spit. And so, yeah, as normally I wouldn't draw attention to this, but I happen to know that Nora and Adam and I had a great time hanging out at ACSA, chortling to ourselves about our strategies for doing the sip and spit in a big tasting like that. They did have the big dump bins. Anyone who's been watching for a while will know I did the whole breakdown of ACSA, and one of the things I talked about was how that large tasting went, and the fact that my favorite comment of the evening was so halfway through the night, so there's these big dump buckets on the table, right? Not necessarily full of spit, mostly full of people just dumping their glasses out into them because they're done tasting whatever and they're moving on to the next thing. So halfway through the night, they rolled around a cart and dumped all the buckets into one giant bucket and then rolled that out. And yes, this is nasty. Someone next to me said, "Jungle shot."
Oh God.
The largest you've ever seen.
Horrifying.
Oh God. No.
Mostly because there was some cream liqueur that everyone was tasting, and so that went in there
waffle.
As well. Yeah. So the combination of cream liqueur and other things was pretty vile. But I mean, for those big tastings,
also that liqueur was ruining people's glasses too.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. And everyone wanted to taste it first for whatever reason. But those big tastings
for everything else, right? That was my thing.
Yeah, it totally coats it. Yeah. But that's research for us. That big tasting at ACSA is an important research thing for us. So we are some of the very few people that spit literally everything in that context to save our palates, because it's a time where we can revisit distilleries that are on our check back into.
I remember what it was. It's the Eggo waffle liqueur.
Yeah, that's what.
Yep.
Yeah, that's Doug said that.
I was too busy trying to think about what it was to catch the said what it was.
Yeah. As I was saying, no. It's one of the times that we can revisit distilleries that are on our watch list to see if they are things that we want to actually pursue after that. And so, yeah, we spit everything. We bring our own coffee cups so no one has to look at what we're up to. But that's also one of my secrets of, because I don't always come off this way, but I am an extreme introvert. So for me, it's kind of either social interactions or alcohol, and they both slowly drain me. And so in those big conferences, I generally don't drink very much because it will drain my batteries twice as fast. So that's my secret, is that I am, even tonight, I have my spittoon. So that's my thing.
I'm dying to see how you're gonna use this. I always try to be discreet about it, right? For the past couple of weeks, I've been quote unquote sipping my coffee cup.
He'll talk and I just lean off camera as I spit.
That's a much smarter way to do it. I have way too far to lean to get off the camera because my camera is a fisheye somehow. I don't know. I need a better webcam. Let's be honest. It's an audio show. You know, we bought the best microphone. Well, probably not the best microphone. We bought good microphones, right? And then sort of went, webcam will do. Okay.
But I do think talking about spitting is really important in these contexts, because it's something that's missed sometimes with people who aren't blending all the time. We spit a lot of whiskey a lot of the time. We don't actually drink that much whiskey. I don't drink as much whiskey anymore because we're blending all the time. And then the last thing I want when I go home at the end of a day of blending is more whiskey. So
it's gotten a little that way for me too. So I mean, obviously, I went to ACSA, my first major conference. I knew there was going to be a big tasting there. I know from having gone to these tasting type events in the past that even if you're just doing a few sips and dumping most of it, with that many things to taste, it's hard to keep your wits about you by the end of the night. Yeah. And I like that I went in with a plan. I was using, the supplements that are supposed to metabolize alcohol for you, that sort of thing. Like I was doing, I don't know if I needed all of these things, but I was doing all the tricks, because really what I wanted to achieve was being able to get to the end of the night without with still an intact palate, because you never know when you're going to come across something awesome, and without making a fool of myself. And so I didn't let loose until the last night, which was still, I had to keep it under control because I had to get up at like 4 a.m. for my flight the next morning. So
we know how that goes. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's practical considerations, but I was concerned about being, the only person who was carrying around a coffee cup or spit cup or something, and I didn't know how to do it. So I'm glad that I ran into you guys before that happened, so that I knew a coffee cup would work if somebody's doing it. And I've said this before. I don't know if I've gone into detail about that. I was nervous about it, but everybody at ACSA was super understanding of, like, yes, I'm going to sip and spit, and this is not me saying anything bad about your product. This is a responsibility move, right? And everybody was so open to that. It was like, it's really awesome to see that side of the inside of the industry, because I think it's easy to believe that people who make alcohol are drinking all the time and expect people in the industry to be drinking all the time. And actually, there was nothing like that kind of pressure.
No, usually the response when we do that is respect. Like, where can I get one of those coffee cups? Because everyone wants to taste everything. And the only way you do that in a real way, and it's everyone's job. And so they want to be able to taste and understand it. The only way you can do that is to really, really, really limit intake. Even if you're not spitting everything, it's a necessity. So.
Well, anyway, all that said, now that I've poured 3 ounces of whiskey that I'm not going to drink.
Yeah, speaking of drinking, seems like it's time for some whiskey.
Yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so we should start at the beginning. So here's how I've laid it out. Let me know if this makes sense to you.
Okay.
So American vatted malt first. So we're going to do the 3 blends is the way that I'm thinking. So we do American vatted malt first, then flame, and then shadow. I would do flame and shadow last, just because they're so smoky. Okay, flame and shadow last. That makes sense to me.
I think we can do AVM first, and then we set it up to do that, and then Gentle Giant, Cedar Ridge, Mountain Meadow, and then the smoked ones at the end, just because they will mess, especially with your experience of Gentle Giant, if you're smoke you've got smoke all over your palate.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you for correcting me on that. I could see your face going, this is going to be a train wreck. So
I mean, you can do what you want to. It's just not going to be as enjoyable to taste that way. So
I definitely.
I was actually thinking
ruin
Cedar
my
Ridge
palate
then
already.
Gentle Giant. in
Gentle
terms of
Giant
single
is
casks.
it's too delicate for the sherry. Yeah.
Definitely an unintuitive Balcones.
Hence the name, and we'll talk about that.
All right, so here's the order that we're gonna do then.
Yes.
American Vatted Malt,
Yes.
Gentle Giant, Cedar Ridge, Mountain Meadow.
Yeah.
Okay, even though that is a very intense flavor,
Flame
because
will-
we're gonna do
Flame can
peated and
handle it. Yeah.
Okay, so and then Flame and then Shadow, because
Yes.
peat will definitely blow us out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, makes sense.
The nice thing is Mountain Meadow, Flame, and Shadow came out in winter together, so we know that they play perfectly fine in that order.
Perfect. Okay, so let's start with American Vatted Malt. So I'm gonna do my thing now, I guess, where I like analyze the specs of this thing.
Please.
So, and actually, let me maybe open by telling my story of how I got involved in American Single Malt in the first place. So, coming out of the height of the pandemic, I believe it must have been early 2021. I don't think it was early 2022. But like at the point where people were starting to get brave and going out in small groups, right? Where it was like the lockdowns had been lifted. I think that was 2021. Maybe
Right.
that seems early.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I've
Time
lost
is
track
a
of the years
blur.
now at this point. But anyway, it was the first time that I'd gotten into whiskey as a reviewer in 2020, sitting at my desk, just talking to my friends, found an online community, found a local community. And then as soon as we possibly could, the local community got together to do basically a Scotch meetup. And there are a few mavericks who always bring something that isn't Scotch. I'm generally one of them. Some people bring bourbon, some people bring Japanese whiskey, some people bring American Single Malt, etc. So going around the table, there was also some brandy there. So like I tried a Bacta, the 150-year-old thing. And some Bruichladdich, and I think even Octomore was on the table and everything. And the first thing that really stood out to me as, oh, that's something special, was American Vatted Malt. It was my first ever taste of American Single Malt, right there on the table. And I was like, okay, this is great. I love this. I was talking to somebody who I met that night, David. He discovered you guys, I guess, somehow, and described you as lovely people. So I imagine he must have met you in person. David K. I don't know if that rings a bell. I'm sure you've met so many people that I think I don't want to dox him, so I'm not going to give his full name out, right? So but afterwards I'll ask you if you know who I'm talking about. And then immediately after, and I knew about Balcones already because I have some friends from the Whiskey Lodge who were really into Balcones. So I looked on the back and I was like, oh, Balcones. And oh, Copperworks, I know them, or at least I've heard of them, right? Because hadn't tasted them yet, but from a friend, I'd heard their gin was good, right? This is such early days for me. It was such a fun time to sort of go like, and then I literally made a list of like everybody else who was on the back of this bottle and said, oh, I need to try them. And then the very next thing on the table was a Balcones Texas 1 single malt, single barrel. And I said, okay, well, that's awesome too. And then I was hooked. Right. And then there was crazy peated things. And I also fell in love with Scotch that day. But that's it's part of a different story, really. Yep. So this really, truly was my introduction to American Single Malt. And,
love it.
After and not like my introduction to whiskey. I had a lot of Scotch at that point. But, that was a night of premium products, right? And this stood out. So that's the point that I'm trying to make. And then McCarthy's was the next single malt. So my third single malt was McCarthy's. Fell in love with them, met Joe, and everything else is history, right? So that's where we are on this one. So for the people who don't know, wallet notice on fleek. I don't understand this comment.
There was a question earlier that I was going to circle back around to later in the show about how big the summer release is going to be for
Oh, yeah.
planning purposes.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yes. Right. Yeah. I think
I'm
we're
not
seeing
gonna-
a 9.
I'm not going to say anything, but you can count fingers. Yeah.
There were some fingers shown. Yeah. Asking for planning purposes. Yes. Very good call.
But
That's
they
a good
may or may
plan.
not be coming out all on the same day. So we stay tuned for more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I need to remember not to get completely randomly distracted by chat when I don't understand the context of the comments. But anyway, so yeah, all right. So what we have on the back, and at this point we've talked about what this is. So
Yeah.
the list of the distilleries is Balcones, Copperworks, Santa Fe, 888, Virginia Distillery Company, and Westward Whiskey, which at this point I've tried all of these, and that's awesome. And it took a long time. I didn't get to try 888 until ACSA, actually.
Yeah.
I figured that would be the
That's
hardest
the white
one.
whale. Yeah,
Yeah.
generally.
Yeah.
And they were one of the ones that was most important to us to include because we had their whiskey and this is going to show my bias, but I truly think they are one of the very, very best American single malts, by far the longest aged one, and spectacular. And nobody really knows them unless there's some familiarity in New York and on the East Coast, but it's just not widely available.
It's only available
So-
in Nantucket and I think a little bit in Massachusetts now, and on
Yeah.
Sealbox. I think Blake on Sealbox still has a little bit, but
So we really wanted to have them in on it, and it was not as old as what they normally do, but it was still the oldest components of the blend.
like
I think it was
7.
7 years.
Yeah.
Which at the time felt very old, although now we
Yeah. And if anyone wants full barrel details on this, it's all on our website. If you're curious, it's
I definitely am, and I need to spend more time with this. I don't know if I've written a review of this one yet, actually, which is, it's funny. Like, I tend to not review the very first thing I have from a brand because I'm like, I don't know the brand yet, right? I need some time. And then as things go, I never get back to it, right? That's kind of the way it goes. So
makes sense. Yeah.
definitely need to add this to the list. I might be on my own for tasting notes today because Phil has a cold. But we'll see.
I'm trying.
Yeah, jump in if something jumps out to you, by all means. But the first thing I'll say is that this is surprisingly bright. It's surprisingly bright and almost as bright and in a similar way to the Mountain Meadow, actually, which is interesting because that's such a unique whiskey. And I'm sure once I actually try that and then go back to this, I'll be like, oh no, I'm completely off. But there's something, I think it's coming from Copperworks. Copperworks tends to be really bright and citrusy. So there's high notes from that. And Virginia Distilling, depending on the type of cask, I'm guessing it was a sherry cask, just blindly from the flavor profile.
I think that's right. That's basically all they do. Like,
I think they would argue they do 3 things.
no, they do, but like at the time, that's all they were offering. They weren't offering any bourbon casks or anything like that.
Because this came out before anything from
None of their own whiskey had come out at the time.
Right. This was
That's
back
the
when they were still doing the hold on a moment. The VHW as their primary consumer product.
Mhm.
Very cool. And I think the element of Balcones that I get in this is a stone fruit layer.
Yeah, I can see that. And we
But
like
it's subtle. Balcones is surprisingly one of the more subtle components of this.
and it has 3. It's a 12 barrel blend, and 3 of the barrels are smoked. One of the ones from Balcones is peated, and then both of the Santa Fe's are mesquite smoked. So even from the very beginning, we were excited about that style.
The unsmoked Balcones is triple distilled, which we've never heard nor seen from them again.
I didn't even remember that.
Yeah. I don't think it's written there because it wasn't on the official notes they gave us, but it's on the sample bottle that we took with us or we shipped to us. It says triple distilled on it. So I know it is.
So now it's written down, virtually speaking, in the transcript of this. Yeah, okay. So collaboratively created 12 barrel blend over the course of a single day. And it's, did you say it's not necessarily 2 barrels from each of the 6?
It is. It
Oh, it
was
is, okay.
not planned, but that's how we ended up. It's 2 from each.
And 3 of them were peated. Okay, so
Yeah.
not all from the same distillery.
One was peated, 2 were
mesquite. So 3 are smoked.
Okay, yeah. So Santa Fe only does mesquited malt, right?
No, they actually have. Well, at the time, yes, but Santa Fe has some unsmoked whiskey out on the market now, which is lovely and worth tasting. But they didn't when we did this, at least that we knew of.
It's fun to revisit this because for various boring logistical reasons involving the Vermont process for getting a tasting room, we can't serve this in our tasting room. So because it was bottled in Virginia, whereas everything else more recently has been bottled here. But it actually means I haven't tried it in a while. So it's fun to go back to it and be like, oh yeah, this is really nice and lovely.
I think at least it used to be the case that the Santa Fe component of this really stood out to me.
Mm.
But I think, and this is my second bottle of this, by the way, but even this bottle's been open for probably 6 months, despite not a whole lot being missing. But, that happens when you're mostly drinking, whiskey of the week for interviews.
Yeah,
so
totally get it.
But yeah, I think the Santa Fe, the smoky, there's high notes to that smoke profile. I'm not entirely sure how to describe, but the high notes from that mesquite smoke profile seem to have faded a bit with time.
Interesting.
And like mellowed out, right? Like in what I think is, a good way. It's cohesive. It's like,
I can definitely taste the mesquite. Can't really smell it. but I can taste it. It's that almost hard to describe, sort of like it isn't barbecue, but that note is in a lot of barbecue.
Yeah, actually, it's coming across a bit like Stryker comes across actually now. And that's coming from, I hadn't had Andalusia until this past December, which first was, I got the Lost Lantern, and then I was already set to visit them.
Nice.
But it was really nice to get those sort of 2, or they served me 10 not whiskeys, not all whiskeys, but 7 of them were whiskeys. That was a lot of whiskey to have in one day. So no surprising that we were sitting and recording for 6 hours.
Wow.
So there's a reason that video hasn't come out yet, because that's an editing project and I don't have time. But I need to find time because it was a really good time. All right, I think probably time to move on. So we're going in palate friendly order, not chronological order.
Yeah.
It's very close to chronological order. So.
Yeah. If we inverted the Cedar Ridge and the Gentle Giant, then it would be. But I think Gentle Giant, well, you don't need to do 2 pulls, but that's fine. It's going to be too much whiskey. But unless, I guess I'm driving home, so maybe Adam wants to have a fun night tonight.
It's Friday Eve.
So Gentle Giant was part of the launch of our single distillery series, which is our small blends of whiskey from one distillery. We've done 1 with Balcones, 2 with Whiskey Delbach. We've done a bourbon one with Frey Ranch, Mountain Meadow with St. George, Kings County, a bourbon as well. And the idea there is we're showcasing a side of a distillery that we have seen, but we think doesn't get shown generally by that brand. And that is better showcased by a blend, because we can sometimes highlight something that may not come from one barrel, but it's a trend that we're seeing. And for us with Balcones, I mean, they make wonderful whiskey, but they're often making face melters. It's Texas. It's big. It's in your face. Often when it's new oak, you're getting all of that extraction. But we knew, having spent a lot of time with the team there in their warehouse, we knew, and tasting Mirador, that there was a more delicate side of what they were doing. So we wanted to showcase that through this, which is why it's called Gentle Giant. And we went down there and spent 2 days blending on site, and we walked in and there were 100 samples, and they said, we're done with Mirador, take whatever you want, do whatever you want. And within 48 hours, we had this. And it was different enough from what they do normally, but showcasing that more delicate, elegant side of Balcones that doesn't get shown as often.
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of Balcones. I think so. I've pointed out already my 17 bottles of Lost Lantern makes that the single most purchased brand in my collection. But I think tied for second, I believe, is Balcones, or pretty close to tied. So I've got Woodinville Whiskey, they're local. Balcones, McCarthy's, I think are pretty close to tied for second place in my collection. So without actually going to do the count. Oh, and Kilhoman. I sometimes forget that I also have Scotch. I had a friend who was basically giving away all of his Kilhoman, and I ended up with a dozen bottles of it. So
a lot of friends like that.
Yeah, that's not. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, that's so. Yeah, if you hang out in the Scotch communities long enough, eventually someone will move out of state or out of country and be like, I literally can't take this stuff with me. So
that was us when we moved out of New York City, and we basically cleared out most of what we had back then, right before we started Lost Lantern. Because I got so much when I was a journalist, as you are discovering these days. And we only kept the things that were really special to us. But a bunch of my friends went home with a lot of random apple brandies from an apple brandy story I had written and things like that.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that I'm a journalist now, because I don't know when that happened, but it doesn't feel wrong anymore.
I guess when you go, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it was a fake it till you make it thing, and then at some point it felt real, but it's hard to say exactly when that was.
Well, when you're invited to a craft spirits conference by multiple brands, it's it's happened. So flavor profile on this one. So Balcones is usually lots and lots of stone fruits, and usually needs a bit of water to open up. And this still has shades of stone fruit, doesn't need water to open up and express. And it also has this lovely honeysuckle layer. And what were you going to say, Phil?
My cold is really messing with me, because the only thing I've been able to get on the nose of anything is cocoa nibs on this. Like not sweetened or anything, just like that, like sort of like bitter tannic cocoa from the nibs. I don't know where
I actually love cocoa nibs. My wife visited Mexico on a work trip and brought back a whole bunch of chocolate, but one of the chocolate things that she brought back was just a bag of just straight cocoa nibs. And I literally munch on those. It's like one of my favorite, like, it's an hour before bedtime and I don't want to have anything too sweet right now. It's perfect. Yeah. Also, here, I do have the box. Ever seen this in Trader Joe's? The Montezuma Absolute Black 100% dark chocolate with cocoa nibs. Surprisingly palatable for 100% cocoa, because the cocoa nibs give it the sort of, it gives it a texture that it would otherwise be missing. It gives it almost a sweetness or like a woodiness, right? But it is, 100% cocoa, not sweetened, I believe. Yeah. Zero added sugars, right? When's the last time you've seen a chocolate bar that has no sugar in it? Yeah, I think only an espresso nerd could appreciate chocolate like that.
Right.
Do you secretly have like a whole other like espresso podcast and it's about all your...
No. So the funny thing about that, the reason for the name Demi Taste is many faceted, right? Demi was the prefix of the gamer tag that I created back in the early aughts, right? On like StarCraft and so on, right? So that's yet another look into how geeky I am. And then I started switching it up because it was Demi Reticent was my username, which was too long for a lot of gaming systems wanted your name to not be longer than 10. which seems like a weirdly short username, honestly. And then I just started switching up the second half of it. So for a long time, I was Demi Meta. That was my Xbox gamer tag, which basically is I don't think I even have an Xbox subscription anymore. So things happen. Demi Meta was also my my Discord tag before I was sort of forced to commit to a new username. And I was just switching up my username, right? I was like, I'm just going to keep playing with the second half. So I was Demi Malt for a while because I was really into American Single Malts. And then I started getting into coffee. Part of that was a pandemic thing. My old workplace had an espresso machine in the break room that I had learned to use. And then like 2 months later, we were stuck at home. And I was like, well, I just got used to espresso. So now I have to have it at home. So I got an espresso machine. I kind of got into like, I'm nowhere near as geeky as the people who make the sizzle videos with the like, I don't do my puck prep in 10 steps. I don't do, close-up videos. I don't do naked portafilter on the bottom so you can see the espresso coming out. I just want to make good coffee. Most of the time, what I make out of my espresso machine tastes better than the commodity coffee shops. And that is good enough for me. And whenever I have people over, I make lattes and they're like, this is the best latte I've ever had. And I'm like, well, you're used to commodity lattes. And this is a latte that I bought good beans. I cared about the prep. I could care more, right? I know enough to know what is geeky when it comes to coffee, but not enough to speak with any authority on it. So there was a time around when I was making my Instagram where I was like, well, this is going to be a whiskey and coffee channel. Why not? I have thoughts on coffee. And then I just being on Instagram made me realize how little I knew about coffee. And I was like, I don't have anything to add to this. I feel like I do have something to add to the discourse on whiskey. So Demi Tastes is a pun on a Demi-Tasse. That's the tiny espresso cup. So that's where that came from. And the Instagram was supposed to be that, but now it's not. And Demi Tastes is still my username. It felt weird to sort of give that up, but I made the Single Malt Frontier Instagram handle to encapsulate things that are just the podcast, because my personal whiskey account is whiskey and more things. It's, plant photography goes up on my story. Coffee occasionally makes it into my feed, my personal reviews and that sort of thing. So it's been a weird evolution. It's hard to rebranding is a hard thing, but the Demi Taste podcast never felt right. It was just a placeholder. And the Whiskey Lodge cast was fraught because the Whiskey Lodge is Phil and I are mods of the Whiskey Lodge, but the Whiskey Lodge is not this podcast, right? It's not for this podcast. It's just a place that we hang out. So the Whiskey Lodge cast only makes sense when we're talking to people from that community, which technically includes y'all. We could have done that, but we've essentially come some distance away from calling it the Whiskey Lodge cast because that's not a branding that consistently makes sense. So hence the new brand. Single Malt Frontier encapsulates a lot more about what we're about. So that's how we landed here.
And I got to say that revisiting the Gentle Giant, I try not to be too biased, but it really is like one of my favorite things that we've ever done, and probably one of the ones that I drink the most of. I love the more elegant and delicate side of Balcones, and I see Jerem says it's the most balcones he's had, but what we like to say is that that is not totally true. Balcones makes a lot of things like this. They just don't get out very widely. It's like Texas or tasting room only. Or it's like a limited edition that gets snapped up right away, but it is our favorite side of them.
This is fantastic, by the way, and it's only an accident that I haven't had a whole lot more of it, and that accident being that I've had a lot of other things to visit and taste since I got this bottle. And it'll be nice if I it somehow seems like I'm about to go into like I want to do a whole bunch of reviews now, and then it's like, oh crap, it's the quarterly dry week, and then I lose all my momentum.
Right.
That's one bad part about having a scheduled dry week, is that like sometimes your body just tells you it's time for a dry week, but then there's the community dry week schedule, and you're like, well, I have to, like, I'm a mod of this community, I have to do it on schedule. And so yeah,
our rule is usually that we don't drink during the week. We taste during the week, but that we're spitting the vast majority of the time. But in the interest of time, we should either skip a couple things or breeze through them, and it's up to you which one you want to do. But
Yeah, I think let's breeze through them. I do want to touch on all of these. I think they have different things to say. Sorry I took up so much time with my own personal anecdote. That was probably not the right way to use your time.
No, you're fine.
But
I slowly
I want to add to that anecdote you had about the tasting room. So I visited Balcones. Jared was the first interview I did when I decided to start doing interviews. And he took me through the whole facility and the tasting room, where Emma was doing her first ever solo blend. I don't remember what product that was, but that was a fun thing. And I was in that room and just looking at, I had no idea how many samples they would be handling. There was like probably 300 samples just sprawled out everywhere. And I could not even comprehend how one person could keep track of all of that. Just mind boggling.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a different scale than most American single malt producers in the US for sure.
All right. So I'm sticking my nose into the Cedar Ridge.
Yes.
Cool.
So bring on the sherry.
Yeah.
So for the first time, I haven't tried this one before, but I have tried Cedar Ridge, so I have that context at least.
So Iowa Single Malt, they are best known for their bourbon, but their single malt is really wonderful. And this actually was Murphy Quint, the distiller's favorite cask, which has now led to the rule of distillers don't let us taste their favorite cask, because if they do, we will usually end up buying it.
Yeah. And Murphy really didn't want to sell it, but Murphy's dad owned Cedar Ridge, and Murphy's dad did want to sell us.
Yes. And we, of course, didn't know about this until later.
We didn't know.
Stolen it away if we did,
but I think we did it justice in the end. Murphy's happy with it. And for what it's worth, so this is Amontillado cherry, which is unusual for cherry.
Yep.
But
and we
definitely
just last week had a sherry episode, so we are well equipped to know what that tastes like now.
And I can taste it.
Mm-hmm. It is not messing around. It's definitely full force sherry. It's for people who, like, from my perspective, like from a Scotch perspective, it's for people who drink Glendronach or Glenfarclas or things like that.
Well, here's a fun fact about this one. All of our single casks since 2020 have had handwritten labels. The Cedar Ridge Single Malt is the only handwritten label that was written by me, because Nora decided my handwriting was too messy to be allowed to do it for any more and beyond that. So look at your label and see if the proof and the number are too messy or not. The correct answer is yes, because otherwise you'll start handwriting again.
They're legible. I chewed it a little too hard, and it went backward.
Right in.
So you must love that one then.
Full sherry, yeah, down the wrong pipe. It's brutal.
Oh, that's the worst. when you're either nosing or like trying to get a small sip, and you've got that like little like reflexive like spasm in your chest, and you accidentally snort a little bit of high proof whiskey.
Doesn't feel good.
We're watching Doug experience that right now. Yeah.
We're breezing right on by. All right, I don't need to ham it up that much. So yeah, it is a sherry bomb, but it's not like, so Glendronach for me, that kind of sherry bomb, I guess Oloroso probably, really just overtakes the malt like entirely. It really just ends up tasting like high proof sherry. The best example of that type of sherry bomb is actually the Copperworks, whatever release that was, where they used the bodega cask, and it was like 100% bodega cask, Copperworks and sherry. Which I have a review up of that one, I know for sure. Really, really good whiskey, but the flavor profile is high proof sherry, like almost 100%. And so this doesn't do that. There's still detectable single malt in it.
Yeah, and
it's also
it's for people who love sherry Scotch, and it's if you're skeptical of American Single Malt and you're a Scotch lover and you taste this, we found this will bring a lot of people around and be like, oh, this has something for me, and it's from Iowa of all places.
And Iowa has definitely gotten a lot of attention recently in the Midwest collection. So more is the better.
Yeah, we love Cedar Ridge. They're one of our core partners, and we think that they do great whiskey of all styles, and that's not always true. We've done single malt, bourbon, rye, and even a malted wheat whiskey from them. They're our first distillery that has been in everything but the gold label.
They got to work on that gold prize. Yeah. One thing I'll say about Cedar Ridge is that they definitely fly under the radar more than they should probably. They're really fantastic whiskey and really up there with the best of American single malts. And it took me entirely too long to even hear about them.
Yeah. I think it's just because of where they are. I mean, Pacific Northwest has a lot of people who are really excited about these kind of things. It's true in California as well. Texas is Texas. Everyone is very excited about anything made in Texas. But like there aren't, when I lived in New York, I didn't know that many people who had ever even been to Iowa, unless it was like to cover a campaign or something like that. And that's a shame because it's a really cool state and not nearly as flat as I thought it was until we visited. But I think it has let them fly under the radar a little bit. But that means it's a good discovery, especially for their flagship, the Quintessential, which is lovely.
Yep. And by the way, people who are watchers of the channel will know that I've done an interview with Murphy Quint.
Oh, nice.
If you didn't know that already, you should go check that out. Despite the audio quality, it is probably one of the best interviews on this channel. Murphy's awesome.
He
You should go check out that interview.
A
Not
lot
to
of fun
downplay
to
my
talk
current
to.
guests.
We have a knack for getting the best guests.
all of our guests are the best.
Should we move on to Mountain Meadow?
Absolutely. So, Phil, I want to know how this one strikes you because I have a feeling that even through a cold, you're going to get a lot from this. I'm not, we got to breeze through these, so I'm just going to go ahead and say right now, this was the winner at my visit to my parents this past holiday season.
Nice.
So I took a full, 17 samples or something like that of American Single Malt whiskey because I had to go to Texas in the middle of December, in the middle of my American Single Malt Advent. And I was like, I still have 14, 15 reviews that I have to write.
Jeez,
So I'm gonna, and I know that sometimes when you're trying to do a daily review challenge, there's just days where your palate can't, or there's just certain samples that you just can't analyze. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna take like 3 extras, so in case I have to skip over something. This one was one of the favorites, and it was my most unique whiskey of the year last year.
Yeah, it certainly is unique.
Yeah, there's nothing else like this. And as we were talking about beforehand, and St. George is one of that is the oldest of the old guard in American craft. They're the oldest craft distillery in the country, started before I was born, and really have been deeply committed to their craft forever, and also just to doing things their own way, which in this case, for all their whiskey, they effectively distill it. They distill barley as if it were a fruit, in the same way that they distill OV, and create a whiskey that reflects the essence of the flavor of barley and whatever else may go into it, which in this case, because this is distilled from beer, includes hops. So this is a hopped whiskey, and you get that immediately from the nose. And I'm not going to give you tasting notes, but I know that I'm also curious if that cut through for Phil.
Oh yeah, that and a surprising like multiflora rose, which is top of mind because there's just so much of it around me. But definitely like multiflora rose that like sort of not exactly piney. Hops is its own distinct scent and flavor that is unlike anything else, and it definitely cuts through. But it's different from most of the hopped whiskeys that I have had.
So this one, I actually, on this one, I reached out to Adam to tell me more about what was in it while I was writing the review, because I believed so many things about this that I also felt were contradictory, and I just like ultimately couldn't believe what my senses were telling me about it, right? So this is super dense in flavor, strong honey that just comes at you from even this far away. Like, it's just, there's so much presence to it. So I get honey, like honeysuckle, a grassiness to it. I don't know if I wrote this in my review, but I'm getting it today. It's sort of minerality to it as well. And definitely on the back end, you get a hoppiness to it. And I think that at first I didn't know what that was. I think I've heard since that some people are very sensitive to hops in especially distilled whiskey, like hopped whiskey. Some people can really tell even the faintest hint of hops. And some people just don't really get that at all. So like, I guess I'm probably one of those people that really reacts to that because it's one of the first things that stands out to me. Even when I get samples that like, you know, it wasn't something that they thought was in it or that they were trying to highlight, but it's still there for me, that hops flavor. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I don't want to say that it's a bad thing. Just for me, it really stands out. And because I know about St. George and their umeshu casks, right? I didn't realize that. I thought at the time, if you're making something and you call it American Single Malt, there's no way there's hops in it, because Bavarian purity laws, I thought water yeast hops. Water yeast grain, right? No hops. So I thought, oh, okay, maybe they're making it from a beer. I know they're making it from a beer of some style, but it doesn't have hops in it probably. So I reached out to Adam, like, were these umeshu casks? I don't know where all this sweetness is coming from. Where's all this citrus coming from? Where's all this honey coming from? Like, how is this even possible? And I believe what Adam told me is that these are all new or used oak.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, used oak is a bit of a nebulous.
They're bourbon, ex-bourbon.
I think one was
Yeah.
bourbon, one was single malt.
I think they're both.
So new oak or ex-bourbon. And I guess where all these flavors are coming from, these citrus high notes, are because it's coming from a hopped beer. It's all coming from the beer, basically. The quality of that beer, the richness of that beer.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was 2 new casks, 1 used cask that previously held Tennessee whiskey, and 1 second fill cask. So Kentucky bourbon, then St. George single malt.
So still bourbon. Yeah.
Bourbon ex single malt. Yeah. Second fill.
Second
fill
it's
ex
second
bourbon.
fill bourbon. It's
Yeah.
We've been having this debate, and I use this Scottish tradition with that. You would never say that a Scotch cask was ex Scotch. You would just say second or third fill. So
Yeah.
because that's a new thing for people to think about, because only now are people starting to do second fill or third fill, like the Scotch tradition.
Brand new thing for American. I think at this point I'm ready to move on.
Yep.
Flame or shadow?
Flame
Next.
and then flame first.
Yeah, I'm gonna say flame first. So Phil, have you had flame before?
Nope.
Okay. So this will be fun. So in case you're not aware, because I know you don't spend as much time on Instagram as I do, when these came out, there was this question going around: are you team shadow or are you team flame? So without putting my thumb on the scale, I'm going to ask you, even through your stuffy nose, if you end up having an opinion.
Yeah, and we often
but that's coming later. You don't have to decide right now, because we're going to have to get through flame and then get through shadow. So,
but we often do, if you have 2 glasses already poured, we do them back to back as a comparison point as well, because they were blended and designed to go as a pair, because it's mesquite versus peat, basically, 2 new American traditions.
So
yep.
flame,
So
sorry,
I know that for flame, you've got Santa Fe and Del Bach. They're pretty much the only ones doing mesquite smoked. You could probably, I think you could find just mesquite smoked whiskey from Andalusia. I think.
I don't think they do. I think they do a smoke, but I don't know that it's just
I
mesquite.
think it incorporates mesquite, but I don't think it's the
Yeah.
only one. Cedar Ridge in Iowa makes some mesquite smoked single malt. For this one, we want it to be all Southwestern. I wish Balcones made some. They made their warehouse is big, as you know, so they may, who knows what is hidden
Yeah.
there.
You never
But
know.
I wish it was something we did on a big scale.
It might be in there.
But this is fun because no one knows what to expect of mesquite smoked single malt. It's something that's relatively new. And this is the first mesquite smoked blended malt. So it's always really fun to pour, both for people who love Scotch and are deeply into it, and for people who are normally kind of scared to smoke. And it turns out they just don't like peat rather than disliking smoke in general.
Right.
Yep. This one was fun. I brought this also to my parents. This is the first time they had mesquite smoked whiskey.
Mhm.
So they had a really good time with it. They thought it was pretty cool. So my parents are interesting in terms of their whiskey flavor preferences. They really like Garrison Brothers, super oaky, double oaked, Texas bourbon, right? As an extreme, and then they really like Lefroy cask strength.
Okay. There is some consistency in the fact
Right.
that they like face melters.
Strong face melting flavors, exactly. And everything in between, I never know what to expect they're going to like or dislike, because usually if it's strong flavors, that comes across well. They really liked Mountain Meadow. They really liked both Flame and Shadow. I think those were their three favorites of everything that I brought.
Nice.
So Flame, I remember I cracked this one open first, and it struck me as I'd had Santa Fe before. I'd had Del Bach before. I had no idea that the blend of them would be so like yet another thing, right? It's got an emergent property to it. It's really nice. It's creamy. It's still got that mesquite smoke, but there's something that, like, the combination of the two distilleries, I guess, filled in the holes of the others and made a really nice round. There's one particular way I like to use the word smooth, where the nose to the palate to the finish is all really consistent.
I'll allow it. She won't.
No.
That's why, like, whenever the word smooth comes up, it's like, you find a better word, right? Consistent, I think.
Or there's continuity.
Yeah.
But I like the way you put it, because we love both Santa Fe and Whiskey Del Bach on their own, but we did think that they came together in a really unique and interesting way that is different than either of the original parts. And I'm glad to hear you say that too.
What do you think, Phil? Is it coming through?
Interestingly, I'm not actually getting very much on the Flame. Most of what I'm getting is like that, like, sweetness from the mesquite smoke. The like, not sugary, but like wood sweet. You know, when you get like sawdust in your mouth or something, and there's that like little sweet note to it.
I promise if you don't have a cold, it doesn't taste like sawdust in the mouth. I hope not.
We're trying
See,
to.
I don't think of that as much of a negative as other people would. But my
Sawdust
second
is a
hope
legitimate tasting note. It's not inherently bad.
but the
And it's like
peat
when
definitely burns through on the Shadow. I don't know why.
All right, so Shadow up next. All peated
Mm-hmm.
American Single Malts, Cedar Ridge, McCarthy's, and Boulder Spirits. And I, of course, am very partial to McCarthy's. So
As are
it's
we.
almost
As are we.
unfair.
Yep.
There's something about that peat profile that McCarthy's has that just always sings through over the top for me. So I've tried blending McCarthy's with other things. Back when they were blending up the PX, I had messed around with putting some sherry in my McCarthy's to see how that would come out. And
Cool.
like, there's just something about it, just always sings right over the top. So, but then McCarthy's is also really bitter on the palate. So, which I like. That for me is a huge plus. It's one of the things that makes McCarthy's one of my favorite things. It's not for everybody though, and I think that the other components of this really fill that in. So I'm imagining these are all not sherry casks, but I could be wrong.
That's correct.
It's just peat. Yeah.
Yeah, the McCarthy's was used oak. The Boulder was new oak. The Cedar Ridge,
Was
was
new.
used.
I think it was new.
I'd have to check. No.
But either new or used, so
Yeah.
that would be either X.
And it'll say on our website. That's all.
So would
there.
that be refill new oak, like second fill oak, or would that be ex bourbon? Or if it was
Second
used?
fill would be like ex bourbon. New oak would be a fresh barrel, right?
Yeah,
But
I think
with
Okay.
Cedar Ridge, it could be single malt twice
it
potentially.
could be. Yeah. I think so. The McCarthy's, which is second fill
Garyana oak.
Garyana,
First fill.
first fill Garyana.
Ooh,
Okay.
that's
and-
rare.
And the Cedar Ridge was
You're right.
ex-bourbon,
Ex-bourbon.
ex-Cedar Ridge bourbon,
Yeah.
which is fun. And then the Boulder was new.
No.
Yeah, but it was fun to blend because McCarthy's, as you say, is very assertive on its own, as is Boulder, and the Cedar Ridge, at least these particular casks were
General. Cedar
They're-
Ridge plays well with others.
they were
Yeah.
pretty chill, pretty friendly, played well with others, and like it really needed that to bring the other two together.
Yeah, Boulder, I don't think strikes me as being super bold, which is, we did try 6 of them in one night with Ryan Negley. So,
But you probably only had the proof down versions. Their cast strength is like hazmat.
okay, this is true. Yeah, we had the 6. They have surprisingly so many standard releases that aren't cask strength. And we got 6 of them, and that was only, a fraction of I think what they had. But yeah, we had 3 of them were under 50%, and 2 of them were 50%, and one of them was 49.5, the mostly water.
We have put out a peated single malt from them that was 149 proof. So at cast strength, they are not subtle.
Wow. Okay.
They're
All
great.
right. So yeah, and of course we're working with cask strength liquids. So
Yeah.
okay. So
Because
really
it's-
strong.
Yeah, it's Colorado, so the water evaporates way more quickly than the ethanol. So yes, their whiskey, the way that they put it out, is more chill, but like their cast strength whiskey is big.
Right, Germ. That's correct. I think we were just debating on, was there anything in it before it started getting refilled with single malt over and over again, first fill, second fill, and so on. So it's either new oak, first fill, second fill, etc., or ex bourbon, first fill, second fill, etc. So it's like a weird thing that you never get in Scotch. This question of, was it new oak or was it ex bourbon? Because it's pretty much a given. It's either ex bourbon or sherry. So
And
here we have, and new oak exists in Scotch, but it's kind of rare. So
in the case of McCarthy's, they use Quercus Garyana barrels that they reuse those barrels. They don't put anything else in those barrels unless it is ready to retire, and that hardly ever happens.
right, it's like 99% of their stuff is just started as new oak, started as new Garyana, and got refilled over and over and over again. So I think one of my favorite single casks was on its 4th fill.
We had a third fill.
Yeah, third fill.
Yeah.
Which this is also why whenever we have any problem with a barrel in our space and need to know how to fix it, Nora calls Caitlin because she is an expert at fixing barrels.
Yeah.
Like physically fixing them or
Yes.
recasking to make the
No,
flavor profile
physically
better.
fixing
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
The Lost Lantern McCarthy's 6 years in the 3rd fill. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I think that's
another
great.
really good one. That was my bottle of McCarthy's 6-year Lost Lantern disappeared. Like it's like is there a hole in this bottle? Like that went so fast.
I
think it
don't
was like
share
2
this.
Yeah, right. It was like 2 months, and I had to buy another one before they sold out.
We have
I've been a lot more careful with the second bottle of it.
we have exactly one bottle of it left in the tasting room, and it's on our last call shelf here. And I keep debating if I'm going to buy it myself or not, because it's one of my favorite single casks that we've ever done. But I also like it when people discover whiskeys from us that they really love.
Yeah.
So
it's been staring at you for a couple of weeks. Yeah.
I'm going to end up buying it unless someone does first. But
So the other thing that
How
sometimes
long a
happens
drive
is like,
that is.
Especially when you're like, hey, I'm going to use a spit cup today. Every once in a while, you'll come around something that's like, I don't want to spit that out. And then you have to make a decision.
Yeah.
So that for me, Shadow was, I think, my second highest rated of 2023.
Wow.
So I'm Team Shadow. I'm putting that on record. I've done it before.
Yeah.
But I will say I was very, very close to being Team Flame because that surprised me with how good it was. Well above and beyond the sum of its parts, in my opinion, as of my experience as of that point. Now, Santa Fe and Delbach have both gotten way better since my initial taste of those distilleries. So that bias is slightly gone now. I think that, but yeah, for me, Team Shadow. And Phil, once you can taste again, I'm going to ask you, but I do have a feeling due to your partiality to McCarthy's, I know which way that's going to go.
Well, and just tonight, the peat is coming through much more effectively than the mesquite smoke is. And I think that is entirely down to the fact that I am so familiar with peat that I can like pull all the peat out of the what little I get.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. As I've said multiple times, I love telling this story. When I had COVID, I couldn't taste anything for like 10 days. And then I didn't want to drink anything for like a month. And then I had a hard time doing tasting notes after that. I had to rewire my brain for tasting notes, which was like scary.
Yeah.
With 200 bottles as of that moment, I was like, I'm about to have a whole bunch of garbage unless I can get back to tasting things properly. So on day 10, after I lost my sense of smell, the very first thing that I was able to smell clearly was a sample of McCarthy's that I had never had before, like a bottling of McCarthy's. And I correctly identified that it was McCarthy's and I had not had it before. And I'm super proud of that. And also that's just, that's how much I love that brand. So
Yeah. We love them too.
Yeah. Here's a fun fact that almost nobody knows because we never talked about it, and you have to stick it around until hour 2.5 of the podcast to pick up on this one. Is that we invited McCarthy's to be part of the first American Vat Malt, but at that point they had to get some like approval from the higher up folks, and it couldn't all happen in time.
I think they were just like, we'll wait and see how this Lost Lantern thing goes, and. Which is fair. We've never been upset if someone responded.
Very nice way, very supportive way.
I mean, Joe. Joe said it in the nicest way possible, but it was still that feedback. And we take extra pleasure now in the fact that they did then eventually sell us casks, because that means that we really earned that.
Yeah,
you
were the first
one of the ones who wanted to do.
Yeah,
the first third party. You were the first third party to bottle a McCarthy's.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's right.
I think that's right. Yeah,
which is awesome. Yeah, Joe has a way of telling you no and making you feel like he said yes, but like in a way that you're still very clear about what he didn't agree to.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can dig out any more questions from my brain, but I think we've pretty much let this run the course. If chat has any other questions, now would be a good time. But while we're waiting for questions, I'll give the usual spiel of. I'll let you form that thought completely while I finish this sentence, Phil. So you can hang out with us in the Whiskey Lodge. That's where Phil and I tend to spend most of our time online when we're not streaming. It's a great place to ask us questions. It's a great place to buy those pens. If you've got a hookup on barrel staves, I'm sure Phil would love to have that. I think that's all I had for the moment. So, okay, go for it, Phil.
First up, Freedom Malts wanted to know if his summer release question got answered, and I believe that there wasn't an official answer, but you know, there are clues for those with eyes to see.
And that's why, you know, once we get the audio podcast going, you won't get that. But as long as the video exists, there are clues. Yes.
The question that I had, because every time I have the opportunity to ask, with a handful of exceptions, I've asked it, is there anybody that you really want to work with that you haven't been able to yet?
We've gotten a lot of the places that we wanted. On the single malt front, Stranahan's would be a big one. I think that they have a lot of, like, especially in their taste stream, they have like 10 and 12-year-old Colorado single malt now, and it's really, really good. And we'd love to make that happen. We would love to do some kind of release that is just from 888. We have them in the American Vat Malt, but the issue being their whiskey is it would certainly go on our gold label, and they're not that very well known. So we want to make sure that we can tell their story in a way that will get people excited about it before we do it. But really want to share their whiskey. Anyone else you can think of for single malt?
That's it.
Yeah. And there are lots of other places that are like on the cusp where I'm like, in another year or two, this place is going to be ready. There's a place in North Carolina called Oak and
Cut
Grist.
Spike for you.
Oh yeah, Cut Spike in Nebraska. It's a single malt that tastes like orange creamsicles.
Huh.
Ooh.
And
That's a polarizing note. I know.
Oh, it is. I don't know if
I'm
we
on
would
the
agree on
fence.
a cask.
I know people who really like that note, and I know people who really dislike that note.
I want to know chemically how that happens, though. You know what I mean?
They're brewers as well. It's attached to a brewery, so I assume it's some crazy yeast that they're using or something like that.
It's been a few years since I took organic chemistry, but I believe orange creamsicle is one of the basic elements and building blocks of the universe. So I think it's like right after helium, before fluoride. So I think that's why.
Right. It's got a low atomic number, orange creamsicle.
I didn't know that.
But in seriousness, is that an easy to produce ester? Because it might actually be more common than we think. Right. Like you've got your isoamyl acetate, which is your bananas. You've got your whatever it is that tastes like apple or pear.
Starts with an M. Malic acid.
Malic acid is well, that's a different one, but I guess there's probably an ester of malic acid.
Yeah.
There's the pineapple oil, like the ethyl butyrate, butyric acid forms with acetate, I guess, or ethanol. That's a fun one. Right, there are things that are like easy to form, right? That's kind of what I'm getting at. And then there's things that are much more complex that have to develop with time and esters interacting with other esters and so on. So I guess I was just asking if you knew which category that sort of fits in.
Don't know.
I don't.
No.
It would probably be a more common tasting note if it was easy to come by.
Probably. Yeah.
So there's that. All right, here's a good question for everyone, but I'll definitely throw this to Adam and Nora first. Do you ever get writer's block for tasting notes, or do your palates just get more fine-tuned the more whiskeys you try?
You do.
I do. There are days when I'm just not feeling it, and then you just don't do it. And then there are times
Or
when
you have someone else that can help you.
That's what I was gonna say. There are some times where I'm like, because I write most of the taste notes for the labels, but we'll go to her and be like, tell me what do you got for this? Because it's usually because I'm having trouble putting it into words, and we're both good at that, and sometimes you just need the second opinion. Yeah. So it's a nice thing about being a team.
Yeah, 9 times out of 10, if it's a baked good, that's mine. If it's anything else, it's his.
Okay.
But generally, if it's like lemon tart or like molasses cake or something, most of my tasting notes are baked goods of some sort.
I feel like you were involved heavily in the tasting notes for Mountain Meadow.
Yeah, what do we have for that? Meyer lemon zest, white pepper, lemon verbena, cinnamon sticks, jasmine tea.
That's all. I think that's mostly you. It would be, if it was mine, it would be like lemon meringue pie, like that kind of thing.
Okay.
Less components, but more like fully formed baked good, like apple strudel or other things like that. That's me.
Do I remember a baklava being a tasting note on one of these?
I don't think not yet.
Not yet, but
Right.
challenge accepted.
Yeah.
So
I'll have to go. There was definitely one where I got that tasting note. I think it's a Westward.
that checks out.
The cognac cask, maybe, I think is the one.
Chardonnay cask is the only one that we've done.
Okay. And so there was a part 2 to that question, so I'll put that up now. Are you afraid you'll become blind to certain flavors?
I'm not.
And thank you for the question, Spicy Strawberry. And they're not dumb questions. They're very good questions.
I think the hard thing is that I think you eventually get too used to cask strength and forget that for normal people, something that is like almost 70% alcohol is very strong, as opposed to like, oh, that's normal.
Right. Yeah. And I think for me, it's less getting blind over time, but we all have blind spots. Like there's a certain type of pepper note in rye that I just effing hate. And it's a moment where he has to turn to me and be like, this is a blind spot. Like take a moment. I know you don't like this whiskey, but like try to pull that. And knowing that about yourself and what you taste is really helpful because we now know where our respective blind spots are. I think that's a super important part of what we do. We somewhat let that influence our picks to a certain extent because that's our perspective. And then there's certain things where it's just like, you have to know whether or not something is objectively good or subjectively good. And being able to separate those, I think, is when someone becomes really, really educated about their own palate. So less of a change over time and more of a just like flavors that one or both of us don't like.
Yep. So I'll take my turn to answer this question now. Do you get writer's block for tasting notes? Yes, all the time. I go through long periods of not actually writing reviews, like per se, because a lot of times I put pressure on myself to say more about about whiskeys that I want to review than maybe necessarily I even have to say. And sometimes I feel like it's just because I'm having taster's block, is sort of what I call it. Like I'll come up with 2 major tasting notes and go, that doesn't give me enough notes to refer back to this without having it in front of me. Yeah. And I feel like I don't want to put out a review with tasting notes until I have enough that the tasting notes will at least remind me firmly of what it tasted like, even if I don't have it with me anymore, even if it's gone, right? And my goal, the reason I started doing reviews is actually, I never intended to have a collection of 250 bottles. Never intended that at all. I intended to have a collection of tasting notes. That for me is a permanent collection. And I still do, right? I want to review everything that I have. So if I haven't finished a review, I put a sample of it aside. Sometimes I get nervous about that sample not being enough for me to finish notes on something. There are some things that just defy my analysis. And sometimes it's just that you're staring at it too hard. Like a magic eye picture, right? There's a picture hidden in that poster, but if you're not staring at it the right way, if you're trying too hard to focus on it, it doesn't come to you. So sometimes you just need to take a step back. And when I was retraining myself to taste after I had COVID, I had to go back and take all of my own advice about how you develop your tasting palate, because I literally had to rewire my brain. I was still tasting whiskey the same, right? I was like tasting something that I tasted before and tasting it and going, that tastes right, but I can't describe it. The only way I'm describing it is by pulling on tasting notes I used to have for that same thing. And that's cheating. Right. I'm not coming up with those notes right now because my brain currently isn't wired to make those associations. And so I had to go back to pour one thing, pour something that's not like it, and describe how they're different and redevelop those tasting notes for what does cinnamon taste like? What does oak taste like? What does sherry taste like? What does almond paste, marzipan? What does that taste like in whiskey? Because those flavors, when they're not in whiskey, are not precisely the same thing. You develop a vocabulary for approximations that remind you what the whiskey tastes like. As for flavor blindness, dry week really helps.
That's interesting. I can see that.
So one of the things that I had to learn the hard way is tasting notes aren't universal. And if you build your tasting notes on memories, like this whiskey reminds me of X, Y, or Z, that isn't helpful to other people because memories aren't universal. And also, especially if you have a weird background and you get notes like, oh yeah, this tastes the way number 2 home heating oil smells, that's going to be extremely off-putting to other people. And people who don't know what number 2 home heating oil smells like won't have any idea what that means. And that's my go-to example of weird tasting notes because it's one that I get on a series of whiskeys from the same distillery that every time I bring up, people are either horrified or amused by.
All right, one last question to take us out. So, when you set out to create Lost Lantern, you had a mission in mind, I imagine. Do you feel like you're fulfilling that mission? Do you feel like you fulfilled that mission? Or do you feel like is an ongoing process or there's still more to do to reach it?
Fulfilling. I think we have so many more schemes and ideas and things that we wanted to do, and even from the beginning. And I think we're doing the things that we set out to do, but there's just so much more to highlight and talk about. So I would say we are fulfilling what we've set out to do, but we haven't fulfilled it yet fully.
Yeah. Well, we do feel like we've answered one of the key questions we had at the beginning, which was, did people want there to be an American independent bottler? And we feel both very warmly welcomed by the distillery community and by people who love whiskey as well. And they're like, oh yeah, this is great. This is a valuable part of the landscape. And that feels really good to us. So we didn't know. They're everywhere in Scotland, but maybe it wouldn't work here. Maybe people wouldn't care. They'd be too into big name bourbon or whatever else it may be. But we feel like we've proven that part of our mission.
Real quick rapid fire question, just a slight follow up. So your tagline is shining a light on the independent spirit. Do you feel that you will limit yourselves to what you would consider to be independent brands?
No, we've already worked with non independent brands. We've from a range of places, including Smooth Ambler, Westward, Westland. Independent spirit doesn't mean independent from a ownership perspective. It's the idea of an innovative spirit, and also a play on the fact that spirit is a drink as well. So
the kind of person or people who are crazy enough to give up whatever else they were doing in their life to say, I'm going to go start a distillery and make whiskey in a place where it has never been made before, in a way that it has never been made before. And then it turns out amazing. That is what we want to celebrate.
And it's a little self-referential too, right? With the independent bottler part and giving that sort of top billing.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. I think now's about the time that we will sign off. So I invite everybody to grab a glass of whatever their favorite thing was tonight. Honestly, I'm having a hard time choosing between Shadow and Mountain Meadow. I think it's Mountain Meadow today.
Okay.
So to helping people discover spirits is a mission that we all share.
Cheers.
So
Sláinte.
cheers. And until next time, we'll see you in the lodge. Good night, everybody.